Blank screen. Javier, how are we doing? What is up? Javier Rivera, Andrew Louver. He's here in Virginia. How we doing?
Hey,
What's up, Javier?
what's up, man?
You gotta come to LA.
Yeah, I do. I do.
Yeah, we moved the whole farm to LA to visit with him. I mean, it was nuts. We put it on the plane. Dimitri, good to see you, sir. Michelle, as always. So Mr. Louver has come all the way to Central Virginia, and we have been freaking nuzzling. You should have seen the nuzzling. I know you're jealous. Like my head goes right here. Yeah, it fits. It fits really nice. Yeah, no, it's good. So now, Mr. Louver, so Michelle and I and Mr. Louver, yeah, you see that angry face? Dude, by the way, I did the stupid thing where I updated Zoom. You know how it lets you update Zoom? Now everything's screwed up and I don't know how to make anything work. So it's always my favorite when that occurs. I know better than to do Windows update anything. But no, we were talking outside on this interesting question. So we're doing moral reasoning, and I might ask you to talk about the book some, because I think the professor, it's just whenever there's like a real professor, like a real thinker, everyone on planet Earth should know about them. So I'm really interested in that work with Wolfsdorf, Dr. Wolfsdorf. But we were talking about, basically the question is the following. When you are dealing with someone who cannot engage or will not engage, perhaps in the moral reasoning to figure out the cause of a problem or situation, is it passive to walk away, or is it wise to walk away? So if you're dealing with someone who doesn't want to think through, say, let's say in dating, for example, or a marriage where there's a misunderstanding about a situation or there's a conflict, and the person doesn't want to engage or maybe cannot engage in the moral reasoning to figure out the cause of that relational conflict. And when you try to talk about it, maybe they get upset, maybe they get emotional. And so what is the right course of action? Walking away, like keeping your mouth shut and not trying, because that could make it worse? Or is that passive and letting the person walk all over you? So it's kind of a question. Another way to frame it is, if you're talking with someone about a situation that requires philosophy to work through, but the person doesn't have philosophy or doesn't care about philosophy, should you just be quiet and not try? Should you try? And is that passive or is that wise? So that's generally some of the things we are describing, because I think this is a massive $1 million question for relationships in general, like when to speak up, when not. And actually, I think it has massive ramifications for communities. All these game B, liminal web, all these different things. When is speaking going to ruin everything? When is speaking going to improve everything? Because you can find the difference to work through it. And without the shared ground of an agreement upon the problem, you can't create from it or work through. But then, of course, getting to a shared ground would require, people who have the philosophical skills to get to shed ground or something like that. So then we were also talking, Mr. Luber, just talking about moral reasoning in general, about context and being in good. So what was the definition from the book he was saying?
So Professor Wolfstor's definition is something is good when it's achieving its purpose to a significant degree. And that's a very loaded sentence. So, yeah, I mean, basically, what is significance? Like context, like his book talks a lot about context, but in that definition, you don't hear the word context. So where does context come about within that definition? There's just a lot to basically Plato's question of what is good? What is goodness? Yeah.
No, and I like the definition, because let's accept that and say that in order to determine the good, you have to determine significance, context, situation. All right, so you're having a relational dispute and you're trying to figure out what's the good thing to do. So if that definition is true, then you have to have people able to talk about what constitutes significance, what constitutes context, and what constitutes, good intention, and what should be the prime thing that you're focused, like the purpose. Mm-hmm. What if they can't do that? What if they won't do that? Is it better than not to say anything, or to try to teach them how to do it? But maybe teaching is kind of arrogant because you're trying to make them fit into your philosophical framework. So anyway, that's what we were talking about over watermelon and fruits. And as Reed, let me tell you, Reed's favorite pastime is headbutting Andrew. Reed goes for the frickin' legs and other things with his head at full speed. And poor Mr. Luber has had a wonderful time catching Reed and going, yay, I love playing hug too, ergo self-defense for his well-being in the future. So those were topics, but of course, anything anyone is working on. I know we had also mentioned in the chat a little bit, Mr. Rivera, Twitter, some issues of God. And then Dimitri, I like your haircut. And I love the Science of Logic conference. That was amazing. Everyone, we had a really wonderful time. I think it was really, really awesome. And so yes, I hope everyone's well. It's good to see you. The weather here in Virginia is nice.
It's been wonderful. I'm so happy that you guys get to see each other and have fun. Yeah, this question of what do we do, right? This idea of, is it passive? Is it wisdom to walk away? Buber actually, one of the things that got him into dialogical thinking was that he had an experience where a soldier came to him in the morning and was wanting to ask him a question. And Buber answered all of his questions. And then the next day, the soldier ended up killing himself. So what does this reveal? It reveals that sometimes the content of what the person is proposing, or even the content of the problem, is not even the circularity of the problem itself. It's not even the problem, right? We sometimes get so consumed in the content of what is being discussed that actually what the person is trying to address is not even the problem, really, right? There's something deeper going on. And to some degree, I agree that context matters, but typically we think context in the context of the problem, right? Like, okay, well, let me address the context of the problem and so on and so on. Maybe we can work this out together. But to me, this misses the existential facts. What are the existential facts? Well, what is it that the person is really trying to address to you here? And sometimes what Buber is trying to say is it's sometimes it has nothing to do with the content of the problem. There is something deeper going on that even the person may not even know what they are actually trying to address when they bring up this problem, right? So this points to a really crucial question, because now it can no longer be a matter of just, do I just walk away? Where's the wisdom in this? It's more about navigating, is it really about the problem that is being presented, or is there something else? And we tend to miss this, as thinkers. We absolutely miss this all the time, because we're like, okay, I'm going to answer your question. I'm going to break down some of the assumptions that you have about this problem, and so on. But this is always a problematic issue sometimes, because I think overall it may not even be the content of the problem or the context of the problem.
We were talking the other day where I have like this concept. It's more of a joke, honestly, but there's some validity to it. I call it ethical manipulation, and basically, like I gave like the hiking example, where it's like you go on a hike with a group of friends, and you're like not in good shape compared to the group of friends, so you don't want to like make the group stop because you're not in good shape. But what you could do is you can kind of disguise that by, wait a second, let's take a moment and embrace this beautiful view. Like you can hide the true sentiment via the expression. So kind of like what you're saying, it's like it might not, what someone is saying might not even be directly addressing the actual issue at hand. So what do you do in that situation? Well, I find it to be almost impossible to do anything if there's no philosophy in the situation. If there isn't that type of discourse where you are open to the possibility that the expression that's being said is only touching upon the actual issue at hand and not actually revealing the issue at hand, you want to kind of discover what that issue is touching upon. That is the work of philosophy in my mind, and you can't actually get to the root of anything without that kind of discourse. But what's funny, on the other hand, it's if you are just radically vulnerable and you're just expressing yourself in a way that isn't fruitful because you are taking a situation with low stakes and making it high stakes because of your radical vulnerableness, then it seems necessary to ethically manipulate, to basically adjust your internal reality to the contextual reality in which your internal reality is embedded in. Yeah.
No, I think it's very interesting. There's a few things. And Chiton, good to see you today, my friend. We're talking about generally kind of the problem of if you have a situation that requires moral reasoning to figure out, because like, for example, if the right action can be very situational or what should be done, well, then you have to have people there who is able to reason through to determine that. And let's say the person can't or is unwilling, is the right course of action to walk away? But if it is that passivity? Or is that wise? You know, how do you tell? How do you not? And so there's also this question of transparency, where sometimes if you're transparent about the fact of, hey, I'm on a hike and I can't walk anymore, I'm tired. Well, maybe everyone now feels guilty for bringing you, and they're like, everyone's like, oh, maybe we should go back, and the hike gets ruined. So maybe it's like smarter to instead go, hey, let's stop and look at the view, where you're getting the rest you need, but you're not putting your tiredness on other people, which then guilts them and makes them feel bad to continue the hike, maybe. But maybe then you're being manipulative, right? Maybe you're doing something wrong because you're not being straightforward, right? But then it would seem like it's wise to do that, right? So there's a lot of interesting questions. So basically that topic in general, and maybe that gets at being alone versus being at, as we talked about last time. And then all the ways you convince children to eat their food. That may also be relevant here because you have to be indirect, or, you know, it's hard to say. So Dimitri, please, and then Javier. And Dimitri, it is good to see you today, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Yes, I'm holding it together still. But I don't know what I want, man. But it's not because I don't know what I want, it's just this universal sickness that we got called hysteria. So but yeah, I'll manage, because that's somehow what you can do, I think. So about this topic, okay, do I walk away? Do I stay with it? You know, this is quite relevant to my project called The Work of Love that I presented about in the Science of Logic. And in that presentation, I mentioned this beautiful quote by Hegel in the Science of Logic, and not Science of Logic actually, but the Philosophy of Spirit, or Philosophy of Mind as it is usually translated. And you know what's interesting, just a side note, is that if you read Hegel's Introduction to the Science of Logic, he says that, okay, first of all, he says that his philosophy, insofar as logic goes, is presuppositionless in this encyclopedic logic. But then in the Science of Logic, he says that a pure science, which would be the science of logic, actually presupposes that you've gone through basically the phenomenology of spirit as some kind of initiation process. So what about that, Hegel? Well, you know, Hegel loves contradictions, and I'm not going to claim that I have an answer to that. But there's something else happening, and this is that, you know, why would you mediate all those super difficult metaphysical categories in the way that he does, you know? Like, of course, there's something to that insofar as one thing that Hegel says is that in actuality, usually it's kind of confused, and we use mutually like confusing categories all the time. So like working through the science of logic helps you to see how actually, Daniel, you talked about this in your presentation. There's I don't actually remember anymore. That's kind of awkward, but I believe Hegel goes from quantity to quality, or was it the other way around? The other way around? Yeah, right. So usually we think about it in the way that I just made the mistake to think, in that logical progression. And I always thought it made intuitive sense. But so I was pretty weirded out when Hegel said, no, it's actually the other way around. But this is what Hegel calls a purification. And he calls it also the loftier business of logic, that makes it so that a spirit rises to truth. And rising to truth in pure thought means that you have attained some kind of deep spiritual freedom. you know, in like being able to reconcile with some kind of comprehension of the absolute as this process of becoming, you know. So so yeah, like in the foreword, the translator actually talks about how distinctions like subject and object to Hegel are not primarily psychological or anthropological or phenomenological, but they are logical, just logical categories at the lowest level, at like a quantum level, we could say. Well, then, but then you read Hegel's philosophy of spirit, and he says that, you know, a man who has developed the character and possesses the power to like endure the negativity of a sudden violent pain is the reason that he can do this is because he's educated. In what sense? In the sense that he has attained some kind of dialectical understanding that can see the positivity in negativity. Now, of course, this is there's different forms of this wherever we go, in what kind of logical category, you know, how the positive is exactly in the negative. This is why it's not just enough to say, well, man, just see the positive and the negative and then it's over. No, you got to go through that conceptual mediation, right? And this is like Hegel says in the Lectures on Logic, you got to set the sense aside, and the strain of negation is going to hurt you. This is why it's so difficult, but you can actually train this. Now, insofar as the work of love goes, this is tremendously relevant to you know, what ordinary consciousness just calls like holding a space of negativity. You know, like when someone would either have some kind of hysterical outburst, or someone would like project some kind of, you know, negative image onto you or lash out at you. Like, what do you do in such a moment? You know, and I don't think, yeah, we can say like, yeah, it's always good to walk away or not, but it's so damn difficult to deal with it. And very early on, if you take your philosophical training seriously, you notice that you know, if you have some kind of right understanding about it, it's not going to make sense that you're going to say, oh man, you just missed out on the quote on page 324, so by the way, you're wrong, and let's move on. No, it's like, it's kind of closer to what Javier actually said, that ordinary consciousness, just as like a philosophical consciousness that's not like completely pure, that's not absolute knowing, is tainted with assumptions and presuppositions, and the job is basically to, like, how do we get rid of them? But this also this always hurts, you know. So yeah, I think it's a good question, like how do you deal with it? And the thing about love that is so tricky, and Hegel says that the reason that love is the most immense contradiction is for the following reason. I'm not gonna quote him verbatim because that's it's Hegel, but he says something like, on the one hand, you gotta let yourself go and relinquish any shame that you have. This is what a pure heart can do, actually be loving in this manner. But also, it cannot lose itself to the extent that it completely effaces itself, you know? So it's not like a complete sacrifice insofar as that you're hurting yourself. Or in other words, you gotta like completely let yourself go, but also also retain some kind of affirmative identity yourself. I'll pull up the quote later for more solid reference. But this is why love is the most immense. Something like this is why love is the most immense contradiction for Hegel, and it's this is where that word work comes in. That it's always a work, and you know, maybe you walk away, and then a few hours later you learn that you should have been there all along, or maybe you stay there, you're like, oh no, I should have walked away from this. And that's just gonna be, I mean, there's always gonna be these types of encounters, you know. Anyway, I'll end it with that.
No, it's an excellent comment. I randomly flash back to in second grade when I'm like, I shouldn't have given that teacher that apple cake because he didn't even like apples and I would have enjoyed it. So you're stuck, at 35 going back to second grade. But it is funny. Also, I'm noticing I didn't give Mr. Luber a cup of water in a 90-degree sort of area. So Mr. Luber's going to die in our house. So, I'm sorry about that. I might go get you one. I feel terrible. Second, it is very interesting. Like if I'm going to count like apple, banana, fruit, all the things that like all these different things, then I'm counting qualities, right? I'm quantifying because there's a shared quality. And so quantification requires a quality by which you are quantifying. But then there's also like a positive negation in where you learn to think quantitatively on its own, where you like become a master of mathematics. So you go to there where you like, because for Hegel, it's like you go into quantity because you start in a quality that's kind of meaningless. So you go into quantity to think of it, but then quantity has to pass back over into quality. And then you realize quantity always passes from quality. But that's the weird thing. Like there's an intentional failure to get to the place where you can understand the right order that required you to do something wrong in a sense to kind of get there. And that's always this crazy fun move that what does that look like in dating? And maybe that's what we're talking about, Hegel and dating. And you've never been able to bring out page 507 of the Science of Logic and figure out your like relational problems. That's so weird. I thought you just sat down, read it, and then you agreed on where you were going to eat that evening. That's really strange. So I'm going to give it to Javier Rivera, Chiton, and then Mr. Luber. But yeah, page 507. It really it makes the decision of where you're going to eat that evening every time. So Mr. Rivera.
I don't disagree with Luber's idea that's why we need philosophy. But what I've noticed is that philosophy is always only a ground for us, really. I'm talking about these specific thinkers here and now. If you say that to another person, that's going to immediately obfuscate, contract, they will melt down. I'm not thinking philosophy. I don't want to be involved in your philosophy, even though we can always argue that they have some type of metaphysical conception about the world and that they do philosophically interact with the world regardless. Philosophy, sometimes the problem with moral reasoning, even with philosophy, is that we tend to do this weird maneuver here where we can reduce the person to a what versus a who. Means that the moral reasoning is always about a who, right? But in the context of what are we deciding to do in this moment, the person that you are trying to reason with is, the problem obfuscates the who. And then so when you're interacting with the person, they become a what, right? They become a what. They're not really reasoning. And so the problem with philosophy sometimes is that even the questions can obfuscate the otherness of the other. That's, to me, that's the problem I see, right? And it's very challenging because we're like, well, how do we navigate through this kind of conception? Sometimes philosophical problems like to do this one maneuver. We like to avoid our helpless state and our state of having courage to do something. This is like Dimitri was talking about. When we talk about love, it is kind of like a letting go. So that means that I do all my philosophy thinking for this moment. What does this mean? It means that I have to relinquish something. I have to let go and go back to a kind of return of helplessness. And I have to make a kind of wager with myself and with this other person that I am interacting with. I have to do a kind of, in the void, I have to make a movement of courage. Do I let go? Do I walk away? This is what your philosophical thinking is all for in the moment of time. Not for you to cater to them towards philosophy, but this is what philosophy prepares you for. And it ironically prepares you for the most helpless moment that actually you don't know what to do. You have no idea what to do, but you have to make a choice. And the pressure of moral reasoning is that the world will not let you get away without making a choice. And so you have to fundamentally wager something with what we're doing. So we have to keep in mind that the risk of philosophy is that it can obfuscate the surprise, the genuine encounter with somebody that you want to moral reason with. And we have to keep in mind that it's always this oscillating tension between, am I addressing a what or am I addressing a who in this conversation? Because remember, moral reasoning is about a problem concerning a who. But that concerning of a who may not be present, but who is present is the person that you are discussing the very problem with. And it's very easy, very easy to obfuscate the other when we want to address the problem. And I'll leave it there.
Excellent. I'll pass it to Chiton and then Mr. Luber. And so there's this issue where if you begin philosophy, are you inframing automatically the other in your frame and therefore reducing them to a what? But what if the inframing would help them? What if they need that philosophical inframing to not end up in a like bad life or something? Then maybe that temporary reduction of them to a what is what ultimately keeps them a who, right? So then it's an abyssal choice of that you think back on your entire life, like the second grade teacher that you gave the apple cake, and you always have to live with that. So then maybe not only is there the risk of getting it wrong, but the philosopher has to be willing to live with the ambiguity, not just have it in the dot, but there's a possibility of having it forever. And that willingness to live with a permanent ambiguity might be something that makes it where people don't want to do it or do relation or just go along. But let me give it to Chiton.
So when we when we enter into these kind of moral questions, and when we are thinking about what do we do in that moment, when we are trying to, in some senses, think about what should be our action, that itself is a moral question. It's not simply a moral question in that moment, and what do we do in that moment. That question, at what point should we walk away, is also a moral question. There's a double bind there, and for some reason, there's a point of violence in that walking away. At some point, there is a responsibility for that violence. And I think as philosophers, as people who want to sort of, Dimitri's question of love comes here, non-violence comes here, all of these kind of questions come here. And we want to keep our identity safe. We don't want to take the responsibility for the violence in that moment. We don't want to say that we can do the violence in that sense. Inevitably, whenever these questions are raised, we have this tendency to keep ourselves safe within the confines of theory, confines of an identity which gives you a certain good answer to that question without violence. Am I right? There's some kind of that thinking at least exists within myself. I'm guilty of it totally. That I have tried to answer that question too safely many times. Without actually fully taking the risk of that violence in that sense. And what kind of philosophy sort of can emerge once you take that risk of that violence completely. I remember Paul Ricoeur had this great paper. I just opened it listening to what Dimitri was saying, Violence and Language. And he asked this question that what is it to be a non-violent man in a war? If you're sent on a war, can you still be non-violent? That means that do you still at all points keep open the possibility for bringing things back into language? That's what it is. It's not that you will not fight the war, but are you open to bringing things back into language in that sense? And this relationship language and violence sort of opens up in that moment. I can quote it also. A very interesting question, open for peace and so on and so forth. And that's what it means to be peaceful. The other thing is that this idea of a moral universe, this human beings sort of put in certain kind of moral world, is an extremely interesting one, because morality actually doesn't only come from living in common with the world, with everybody else. It also comes from a certain isolation that language is capable of sort of giving to you. You can be isolated, in spite of having speech. You can be sort of devoid of speech even when you're talking. It is that capacity for isolation that shapes the moral universe. If its moral world was simply a set of rules and you could follow the rules and it would work, morality would have no meaning. Morality has a meaning because there's a grammar there. There is something which cannot be reduced down to a complete judgment in that sense. And this capacity to be left isolated, this capacity to be excluded, exists within the domain of language, just through being an act of speech. And that is what gives the texture of our moral world in that. That is where morality becomes so important. There's something at stake in morality at all points of time. And for some reason, we are never able to completely be honest about that stake. For us, morality is simply a question of doing the right thing, doing the thing that everybody sort of accepts and agrees with us. But that stake, at what point language can betray you, at what point your speech doesn't remain a speech, it doesn't come into the public sphere, it doesn't appear in the public. That is the moral stake. So if you have a moral claim, it appears in public, it is something which is there, but at some point you can be excluded from it. Even when you're being completely moral to you, what you're saying, you're trying to do philosophy, you're trying to do great things, even then you can be excluded. What is it at stake in that game of identity? If you go and work in the real world, that stake is always there. No matter how good philosophy you know and what kind of philosophical arguments you can make, then what do we do? How do we think through that question?
Magnificent comment. I'll give it to Mr. Luber. And I think definitely this notion of there is a temptation in philosophy of how do you avoid the stakes? Like, how do you create a certain framing where there are no stakes? Well, if you so accomplish that, that would be like changing the situation to something isolationist. Like wherever there are people, there tends to be stakes, right? So there's this interesting sort of idea that isolationism is kind of counter to the moral life, which I think is a lovely comment. So the question is like, how do you go about discerning the best way to go about exercising the stakes, right? As opposed to avoiding the stakes entirely. And I really like this kind of, I guess, McCurve-Wolf talks about the tension between exclusion and embrace. And I really like the point also of the nonviolent person in war being, can you be nonviolent in war? And that would be a willingness to bring it back to language. But of course, if you bring it back to language, you're bringing it back to the domain where this very violence and risk occurs, right? So there's almost like, there's war, nonviolence for war is bringing it into a different kind of violence. Or you're just leaving language entirely, in a way. You're entering into the isolationist sphere. So I like that framing very much. Mr. Fishman and Alexander, please, and Chetan, please.
Can I quickly quote him? He who upholds it continues to recognize the other as a rational being and attempts to honor him. Furthermore, he retains for himself the possibility of again entering into discussion with his adversary in time of war. He will never commit an act that will render peace impossible. In this manner, the pressure of a morality of conviction can be maintained on a morality of responsibility. The place of the testimony of the non-violent man remains marked in history. By his out-of-place, untimely gesture, the non-violent man bears witness for all men to the goal of history and of violence itself. It's a beautiful, I think, set of lines. Yeah.
No, it's a beautiful reading. I appreciate you sharing that. And indeed, there has to almost be the removal of philosophy as an avoiding of stakes. Like, because if you're thinking that philosophy is somehow a removal of stakes or a removal of even a choice, because it's almost like there's almost a temptation of, if I can figure the situation out, I don't have to make a choice. I'm just following what's right, right? So there's no choice, ultimately. There's no violence, but that doesn't seem to be the way or the right framing. But with that, let me give it to Mr. Andrew Luber and then Javier Rivera. And again, Mr. Fishman, good to see you. And Alexander, good to see you as well. So Mr. Luber.
Yeah, if you avoid the stakes, then when the real emerges, you're really going to crumble. Like if you, to me, what philosophy does, it doesn't avoid the stakes insofar as you get into like a feedback loop of questioning where you can't even make a decision because you just keep questioning and questioning and questioning. I mean, I guess you could argue that the very act of continuing to question is a sort of decision of sorts, but regardless, the language is always a dialect between the value in relation to the context that the value is embedded in. And that's like right. Basically what Woolstorf's book is talking about. And that morality is basically that relation's consequent. That a cup, morality is typically seen when you think of good, it's in the moral sense. But his point is that this cup right here, like there's goodness to the cup, to the actual what the cup is, the purpose and whatnot. But with regard to what you were saying, Chetan, with the like the avoiding of violence, it's what philosophy does. It manages the stakes. to the point where the stakes never feel overwhelming, where you feel like you're either trapped in the stakes or that you can basically what philosophy does, it appropriately positions you in a place that you can respond to any given stake. And that is basically because you're valuing the relationship. You're valuing the relationship over any particular experience or any particularity within an experience. So I just think in that sense, you can't escape morality, because you can't, in a relationship, there's always a value of sorts relating to some context. And that is how morality emerges to be something moral. Like Kant's categorical imperative is basically, he's able to formulate that based off the fact that he's able to say, listen, if you have a certain value, if you see value in this way in relation to seeing context in this way, then what will happen is the categorical imperative will emerge. So it's a form of clearing of a type of interaction that is based off in an agreement on the parameters of what that interaction is. But what Dimitri was saying was making me think about, I have this notion, and I was talking to Daniel about this. We were walking, he's a gorgeous farm, guys. Like it's quite ridiculous. We're like walking down basically like the street to his farm, and like we're looking at like the moonlight, and we're talking, and I'm very obsessed with like Stephen Wolfram. I'm kind of obsessed with Stephen Wolfram just because when he talks, it's like just an interesting guy. But his whole notion of computational knowledge, what I find that gets overlooked is this notion that I call like computation interpretation, where basically when I go on ChatGPT, like I did before coming to Lynchburg, Virginia, I wanted to know the population. You know, like it's a small town in the middle of the country. Like I'm thinking, just curious with the population. So basically, when I type in what is the population of X city in Virginia, it presupposes what basically civilization means. It presupposes what like a city means. So there's this whole like it's able to know without explicating how it knows what like a town is. So I think there's a level of computation where on such a basic level, there has to be a type of interpretation that grants the possibility of knowledge. And how that interpretation is structured is essentially what grants that possibility of knowledge. So I am very curious, like with my whole storytelling project, which to me, within the computational sphere, if knowledge is on the top here, the base of that sphere is interpretation. Storytelling deals with the base, the actual interpretation that leads to possible knowing. Or in the case of what I'm saying between value and context, that the consequence of every value and context is some moral arrangement, moral agreement between that value and context. When people talk about morality, they're talking about morality in terms of morality and not in terms of the presupposing factors that make up morality, just like with knowledge. And when you start talking about story and you start talking about this like raw interpretive dimension, it could get dangerous. It could get very dangerous in that you can, from an outside viewer, you can seem like you're manipulating someone, right? Like you can convince, because if nature and notion are part of the same side of the coin, then you can really control someone. Like you could really make someone, like if you want to control someone, make them think that they don't know anything and watch how they come to you. Like that's how you control someone. And that's only based off of really manipulating and creating a certain type of amalgamation of a structural or interpretation that basically opens up the possibility that they don't know anything, or that they discover a type of knowledge, and that knowledge is different than the knowing that they had prior to entering that interpretation realm. Exactly, gaslighting 101. But it's basically my point with like the what versus the who, with like what Javier was saying, to like to tie that in, it's that you can't really know the what until you know the who, and the who is such a raw, like, you can really gaslight, manipulate, whatever you want to call it. You can really structure that in, like, I don't want to say an infinite amount of ways, but it's seemingly infinite from our finite position.
Beautifully put. I'll give it, and so a few things. First off, Mr. Luber is really good at catching fireflies and giving them to Grace to put in his pocketbook. Well done. The other thing is, we were in town, and the frickin' gear shift of the car would not come out of park into reverse to drive. Mr. Luber is the craziest thing, and Mr. Luber had his phone, because I don't have a cell phone, and we were able to take the gear shift apart and get home. So Mr. Luber will be coming back to Virginia every week, because he's almost died, and my daughter forces him to catch freaking fireflies. So real good guy. So there's a few things. So Mr. Fishman, Alexander, one of the things we were kind of talking about is, let's say you're in a moral dilemma, where you're with a relationship with someone, and in order to understand the culture of the dilemma, you need philosophy to frame it. And the person, say, doesn't know the philosophy or is unwilling. Is it best to walk away or to try to teach them? If you teach them, aren't you kind of framing them in your way of viewing the world, which is a kind of violence? But if you walk away, what if that's passivity, or is that wise? Right? And so there's this kind of issue of like, what's the right thing to do? And really it kind of sees, in some respects, you can't really talk about a right thing to do, but a management of risk. And then also Chiton is making a lovely point on, like, no matter what you do, there's a kind of violence. So it's funny to think that all morality involves violence, because usually we think of morality as escaping violence, unless you're escaping language. But if you're part of language and entering back into language, there has to be a violence, because then language itself inframes or brings with it a certain definition of a civilization for population. Language always brings a note. So there's almost a thing of morality is always a kind of violence that requires a certain management of stakes and making a choice. And that violence, though, makes possible knowledge. So you need violence to get to knowledge, to get a ground. But the moment you get a ground, what if you've just manipulated them to your ground to see the situation according to you? So you're always engaging in violence. So what would be a loving violence? Like, what would it mean to engage in violence lovingly and bring about, like, violence in a manner that is loving, or helping sort of bring people to a place of knowledge thanks to a violence that sets them free, right? So, maybe there's a loving violence or a bad violence and things like. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, real quickly, let me just squeeze in. I think to answer that question, the loving, to love in that interpretation dimension is basically you yourself being open to not having a sense of knowing, like, the outcome of where that, like, when you go down that story of the interpretation dimension and you finally finish your story and you get some knowledge, basically you have to enter the story not knowing and being open to not knowing. And if you go in already knowing, then you are manipulating.
But are you going in already knowing to have philosophy? Yeah, like, if you know philosophical ability, is there already a going in? So then it would be a kind of philosophy that is in service of staying open, as opposed to kind of enforcing.
Yeah, I mean, to Javier's point earlier, it's like, if you say you need philosophy to, like, the average person, it's like almost like WTF, it's like, what are you saying? Like that seems pretty intense, like, from the normal person. It seems to be that philosophical training does seem to imply to me that you are inherently already manipulating the interpretation state in a certain direction. So that for me, it makes me think of just like Heidegger in terms of like, what is thinking, and basically trying to break out of having that philosophical disposition in that interpretation state, and that's what it takes. You need to constantly reflect on your philosophical disposition in order to break it open, in order to actually do thinking, to be open to going down the interpretation journey into getting some possible knowledge. That would be my answer.
I think that's beautifully put. I'll give it to Javier. But maybe a reason we don't do that is because that means you're keeping open the space for a relation that brings the trauma of the real, right? That means you would have to face the real. And boy, howdy, that's not fun. You know what it's like when frickin' Reed tries to headbutt you. So Javier, Dimitri, and then Chitan, please.
Yeah, so like Chitan said, this moral reasoning is always twofold. Even what we're doing right now is kind of moral stake in some ways. We're already moral reasoning about moral reasoning itself. The other thing that we have not brought up is the contingency of time. This is where we can also, it's the manipulation point is a good point, but we have to understand that the manipulation is also twofold. That even the person manipulating is manipulating himself because he thinks he can reason the future in some ways. Right? We are reasoning an outcome about something, and we're drawing a line and saying, okay, this is good, this is bad. We're going to, this is what we believe, right, is the right decision. But even decision, when do we draw the line on decision to say that it was a good decision? You know what I mean? Like this, once you throw time in there, more reasoning gets even more groundless than we had expected. So it's like when we throw time in there, what are we doing then when we are more reasoning in the contingency of time? When the person cannot even by virtue experience and live the future as we are morally reasoning about it right now. Right? That to me, that is like, I understand that we're weighing the risks, but the risks only become weighed because you have to make a decision, right? You weigh the stakes because you have to make a decision at the end of the day. Life will force you to make a decision. The other thing that is more complicated, actually, to your point, Daniel, yes, you're correct. Sometimes my what can become a who for somebody else. Sometimes my own stance on a kind of philosophical moral reasoning can help somebody encounter something that they did not expect, right? My very own position can help surprise someone. The question, I guess, it may even come down to a question of surprise. How do we leave open this idea of surprise? Not only it's not just for the other person, but for ourselves when we are attempting to more reason with somebody else. How do I keep open a kind of surprise? And then we get questions of anticipation. Can we really go forward with a mode of unanticipation? I find this impossible, actually. I don't ever find a moment where you will not anticipate. But I think the maneuver is that we have to commit a kind of violence against ourselves, that we understand that in the moment of my anticipation, I can let go of this anticipation. But it's important that we understand that we're always anticipating. But I think it's important that we acknowledge in the moment of anticipating that we are anticipating, which kind of does a kind of negation of itself in some sense. Because that very anticipation is what also can prevent you from encountering the other and the other encountering you. The other thing is that we're discussing difference as well. The fact that the way I want to moral reason, the other wants to moral reason in a different kind of manner. And this is always, you can tell it's always an encounter with another, because even when we discuss our different definitions of philosophy, moral reasoning, and everything, you can really tell it's sometimes it's not even about the definitions. It's how this individual decided to weave and go through life in a kind of a mode of being, in a kind of interpretation about life. And so, you know, in this case, I agree with Tom. We can't escape the violence of what is being. We can only hope that in the moment of my decision that maybe it didn't come out violent, but it's always going to come out violent, because at one point you have to either commit a violence against yourself by this kind of letting, or by your refusal to let go, you commit a violence. So you don't you don't escape this violence in some ways. Like I always said, love is very violent out there.
No, that sounds like a great album name. Love is Very Violent. Javier Rivera will be really good. I'll give it to Dimitri and Chetan. It's making me think now that is the choice self-negation or auto-cannibalism? Like self-violence, like you do the violence on yourself, or you're just going to end up auto-cannibalistic and hurting other people. Like we'll talk about autonomous rationality. It's like it's a situating of the violence, really. You can't escape it. So if you get clear in your head, philosophy must have some kind of violence to it, then the question becomes the situating of it. And how does one avoid, say, auto-cannibalism? How does one direct the violence so it's a negation sublation as opposed to a self-effacement or something? So it's interesting. But Dimitri and then Chetan.
Yeah, that's Xavier, you really worded this beautifully. This committing violence to either yourself or having to do it to the other. And there's two thoughts that come into mind for this. One, this choosing to do that violence to yourself instead of the other. This is actually like this is self-harm, of course, but we need this self-harm for spiritual liberation. And it is doing violence to the understanding. That's what I think as well. It's a doing violence to the understanding in the Hegelian sense, right? Because the understanding would just absolutely oppose the terms and just swallow the other in an abstract way. Whereas, turning into yourself and withdrawing or like doing violence to yourself is a kind of letting, like you said. Now, to the points of love and violence in the Science of Logic, Hegel says the universal concept is itself while reaching out to its other and embracing it, but without doing violence to it. It is free love and boundless blessedness. Now, somewhere else, I believe it's in the philosophy of history, Hegel actually say that he will describe absolute blessedness with the words absolute negativity, or like boundless blessedness with like the words absolute negativity. So love is both, it's love is inclusive of that absolute negativity as well as that boundless blessedness. If it would merely be the latter, it would just be some kind of edification, and it wouldn't really rise to the idea of what love truly is, in a way that it can be inclusive of that, like Hegel says, that seriousness, that suffering, that patience that it requires, and that also therein requires this self-harm. Like love in that sense requires this violent self-harm. Now, last 2 weeks, I've been obsessed with this paper that Hegel wrote in like 1798. He wrote it when he was like 28 or something. And every few days, I just come back to it and reread it again. And Andrew, the points that you were making in like the asymmetry of power was very interesting to me too, because Hegel talks about how this kind of relates to love. And I will read a Hegel quote again, because I haven't done that enough at the net. True union, or love proper, exists only between living things who are alike in power and thus in one another's eyes living beings from every point of view. In no respect is either dead for the other. This genuine love excludes all oppositions. It is not the understanding whose relations always leave the manifold of related terms as a manifold, and whose unity is always a unity of opposites left as opposites. It is not reason either, yada, yada, yada. So the important thing is that, while Hegel was writing this paper, he was still going through a philosophical transition. So I think mature Hegel would say that actually reason can comprehend it, and we can take this from his more mature writings. But what strikes me as kind of intense in this quote is that he says, in one another's eyes, they are living beings from every point of view. In no respect is either dead for the other. Now, why is he saying it so viscerally? Why is he talking about it's either alive or it's dead? and that love entails this not being dead in no sense for the other. Now, in the philosophy of spirit, Hegel talks about how about infatuation, basically, and also the problems, and maybe even like the fakeness of infatuation, insofar as it does not turn into a work of love, let's say, a work that is inclusive of that, of those convulsions of the concept in the restlessness of life. Now, in this quote, I will not read it fully, but he says that, like, if a lackey falls into love with a lady of higher status, such a love affair would be absurd and ridiculous, even if the representation of this passion comprises all the depth and the full interest of the glowing heart. Now, why is this the case for Hegel? Why would be an infatuation of, like, with a class difference, or a difference in interest, perhaps, or like a difference in the spiritual height of love? Why would there be a problem with this? Well, I think it has something to do with what he says in the paper on love, that in that sense, either the lackey or the lady of high status would be dead to the other in another sense. So love is fundamentally about a sublimation, and a spiritual kind of sublimation, and that's basically the point that I want to make, and I'll have to continue developing it. So.
Well, I can't wait till you get hired to do the audiobook on Hegel. You have the lovely voice with the beat. It's very, very nice. And
we should just get all the times in the net that I
together.
just get a Hegel quote.
Yeah,
and
just put them together. It's going to be fantastic. So I think it will go well. No, I appreciate all, Dimitri. I'll give it to Chiton, then Alexander Ebert. And maybe I guess my initial impression quickly is kind of the idea that you're like in love. There's a temptation to be dead because you're afraid of doing a violence to the other. So you become basically dead to hold yourself back. But this isn't love. Like, you have to be alive, but if you're alive, you're committing a violence, right? And then it's like what we keep kind of coming at is, it's like, it seems to be the choice of violence to self or violence to other. And there's kind of this emphasis on violence to self. But what if the other is, say, contributing to global warming, or they're a bigot or a xenophobe, or they're a Nazi? Maybe violence to other would be good in that situation, right? But then, of course, maybe you're just framing them in a non-redemptive way. Maybe they're a Nazi, but they really don't believe in the Nazi party. They only did it because they were forced to, or something, in Germany in 1950. You can come up with scenarios, right? But there is still the theoretical possibility of a kind of violence to other being good, because they need to be inframed in a better way, right? But then how do you know if you're not manipulated? There seems to be a risk. And then it makes me think of Mr. Ebert's point, and I'll give it to Chiton, where there's a temptation now with ChatGPT, because you're like, oh, I don't want to risk any kind of violence. So ChatGPT, what do we do in this moral situation? And we offload it to ChatGPT, and then there's no risk of us doing violence because we're just doing what's rational. And maybe in the current situations where you have all these different relations and pluralism and globalization, the inescapability of violence becomes more clear. Therefore, the temptation of offloading it into an ideology, a conspiracy, or AI becomes stronger and stronger. So the banality of evil AI in Jerusalem that Mr. People. Let me give it to Chiton and then Mr. Ebert. Chiton.
I'll just sort of quickly. So I think one thing is that violence and non-violence are not opposite things. They're not. At least they're not a defining opposite. Feature in that sense, because non-violence is a particular way of engaging with violence. Non-violence is never the absence of violence. If there's absence of violence, you don't need non-violence. In fact, non-violence as a term loses all its meaning. Non is a very interesting. That's the first thing. So one should not be very anxious about violence, that violence is there in that sense. Violence is structuring the human contours at all points of time. It's just that we have this access to something called non-violence in most situations. The real opposition is either between violence and language or violence and silence. That if you have to oppose violence, you oppose violence by bringing violence back into speech. It is there. Violence, if violence is given its home in language, it is there. It finds its sort of, or either it's in silence. And silence sort of, we can keep it outside for a minute, but silence has some very interesting features there which needs to be thought through. But language definitely sort of opposes violence in particular ways, because if you want to create a political sphere, the reason political sphere always need to exclude violence is because it has to give space to language. That's the nature of that beast. In that sense, that is why even once violence enters politics, it fundamentally corrupts it. There's no politics possible in that sense. The other thing is, which is very interesting about this question about reason and philosophical reasoning, is that to what degree reasoning, and by extension philosophy, as this grand art of sorts, is consensual. At what point does reasoning becomes a non-consensual affair? At what point my capacity to reason can, ethically, morally overstep the consent of the other person to engage in that reason. I think that there's something very interesting about that. And I sort of first-hand engaged with that question. I had my first girlfriend. I was practically married to a girl basically at some point for all practical purposes. And we started dating in school. And I remember one of our earliest fights was about this question. I just started to sort of discover reading, thinking, that you're young, you're shaping yourself. And I just discovered that the very fact that I can read and reproduce what I'm reading can be violent to somebody. It was extremely violent for her at that age, because her approach towards life, and it's nothing to blame to her. She was a beautiful person. Looking back, it was all my fault. All of that is true, But she wanted to enjoy things. She wanted to, approach them, and things that I can do today probably much more freely than I could do at that point of time. At that point of time, because of me engaging in this exercise of thinking at all points of time, made very simple things difficult for her. It may be sexual activity. It may be, questions of lying. It may be questions of, at what point you want to, what kind of movies you want to watch and books you want to read, and all kinds of things. How you want to study for exam. All those things, all those questions that raise certain ethical and moral issues became a point of conflict, because I didn't want to sort of engage with them from the same standpoint she wanted to discuss them with. She wanted to discuss them with me. I wanted her to first discuss it with 10 other thinkers that I'm reading, and then to me. It's something of that nature. And she would say, "Where's your voice? When are you talking? I can read this in the book or whatever." Essentially, it became. We eventually had to break up at some point of time, given that situation. But essentially, this question emerged to me at that age itself, that at what point I'm breaching her consent. By just my engaging in certain forms of reasoning, certain forms of thinking, her consent is being breached. It's not even as to talk about it. The very fact she knows a response like that can come from me itself can be a breach of consent. She doesn't even have to come and talk to me about it. Many times she would call me and tell me, "Chetan, don't speak what you are thinking. Just listen." It would go to that extent. How do we think through that kind of a problem from the other side, where any kind of philosophical reasoning can be a non-consensual affair? And reasoning itself can become like that after a point. And it does become so. I think yeah.
That was magnificent. I'll give it to Alexander Ebert and then Javier Rivera. So now I'm imagining, like, you're talking and you bring up philosophy, and somebody goes, hey, was this consensual? Like, you got the police for the philosophy, because they're like, no, they didn't agree to this. They didn't want to talk about it. Like, the police going through it to get a ticket, get like a $50 ticket. Yeah, man, I did non-consensual philosophy again. Dang it. I gotta work on that. That's actually a brilliant framing, because then the question is it the person's fault for being so adamant about this is non-consensual reasoning? Or is it your fault for like framing them that? And I love the point too, as well, just knowing that you may bring up Hegel at any point means you don't get invited to parties. That may or may not be true. It's very true. So as a kind of thread in this notion of the non-consensual, but is that non-consensual, it's like in this way, is that good for society? is that good for community? Because it can shatter the whole thing, but there's also a danger to it because then it can set people up for the banality of evil, thoughtlessness, or the inability to kind of think through. So I really like, yeah, you don't get to attend because you're always talking about Buber, Javier, I know. But let me give it to Alexander Ebert and then Javier Rivera. Mr. Ebert, it's good to see you today, sir.
Good to see you guys. The question of the relationship between difference and war, you know, it's tempting and probably true that, you know, difference is war and sameness is love. And that war itself is the anticipation of love, the anticipation of union, or it's basically sort of, you know, foreplay to the unification. And I would say that language vis-a-vis difference is war. Simple language is war, in the same way that I think, you know, property is theft. And what language is doing by even designating, right? Like, by even designating this is that, by even the process of othering, which is the basic premise of language. There's, of course, like, or maybe not of course, but there's a lot of newfangled therapy. I remember getting this advertisement on Instagram all the time about this couples therapist who was like doing some kind of ad, and the whole thing was about how language ruins relationships. Like, language is what ruins relationships. Talking is what ruins relationships. And I've experienced it myself. I was in a somatic therapy thing with my girlfriend. Actually, we're breaking up now, and we've had this like 3-month slow breakup. It's been amazing, loving each other the whole time through it. It's been brilliant. But anyway, the therapist was like, look, stop talking, talk in jungle speak, talk like you're Tarzan. So I'd be like, me sad, you know, she'd be like, good. And then, you know, the whole thing would start to really develop in a much better way. And all of a sudden, Lindsay could hear me because I was talking in the most base language. Like, there was the least amount of war. You know, I'm identifying me and I'm identifying how I feel, but basically that was the threshold beyond which there was no more language. And she was able to hear me the more I reduced it, right? And then you get to just pure body language, and it's even better. It's like, just touch her, hug her, whatever the case. And so anyway, I think that language is war. And just the relationship between love and war is very interesting, I think, because war is sort of the foreplay for love and unification. Like, I'm going to invade that country and make it mine, and now we're unified and we're the same thing now. But then you end up, in Cadell's just recent paper, he did a really nice sort of like recap of the science of logic thing. But anyway, he was referring, I think when he was referencing my little presentation, a Zizek phrase, Zizekian phrase, absolute recoil. And so we think about this relationship between war and love. It's like, well, theoretically, in our minds, of course, it's like, well, we would stop it. Like, we want love, we want the unity, and then that's where we end up. That's what we love. That's, like, as Dimitri said, of course, sublation is the unification. So love, if love is, you know, apropos of unification and sameness, and war is apropos of difference, then we would theoretically want to stay in this place of love. And we're in this place of love, and we've reached the unification, and here we are. But this is the moment of the self-relating negativity, where you're in it, you're in the self-same, as I was describing the other day, in the self-same temperature, self-same density of the womb, where there is no interior-exterior split. You're in this unified state where there is no self and other. There is no difference, so there is no war. But because of that lack of difference, at some moment, some given threshold, and I believe that that threshold is temporal, at least in the world that we live in, that threshold is a la Deleuze, a pure difference vis-a-vis time. So exact sameness, and the only difference is that you're the time, right? It's 1 second to the next second. It's the same thing, but it's different. It's pure difference because it's that same thing in a different time. So time is the mediator of this pure difference. And all of a sudden, there's some threshold of that pure differentiation vis-a-vis time, after which you have a self-relating negativity. You're like, I got to get the fuck out of this love, this self-sameness. I can't stand anymore. So it's this absolute recoil, right, from that moment, this self-relating negativity. We're like, I'm out of this ablation. I'm back into the war. I'm back into difference. And, you know, and this is, of course, this process. You have this process of feeling love, expressing war, and you express the war to get back in love again. And then you feel, and then you recoil from it, and so on and so on and so on. And I think one interesting thing to really understand, and is glossed over a lot, is this absolute recoil, that operation. What is that thing that makes us reject utopia? What is that thing that makes us reject the optimal state? And obviously we can like chalk it up to like big ideas like the death drive or something, but like, why? Why do we reject perfection? Why do we reject comfort? Why do we reject, well, stasis? Why do we reject the very death that we're after? And I think that's fascinating. And I don't think anyone's really figured that out yet. Like the why. We know how, but why? And yeah.
Lovely, Mr. Eben. First, it's always good to see you, and thank you for being here, especially with a deadline like that. And I would love to meet. Like Jungle Talk Valentine's Day cards is going to be amazing. So instead of like doing it in English with Jungle Talk, and that's really interesting too, because it's almost like you're committing violence against the violence. Like language has a certain violence, a certain framing. So how do we like do a violence against English by doing Jungle Talk instead? And it's interesting, by directing the violence on the violence, changing the quality of the violence, then there's a clearing that opens up, like an ability to relate to the person. So it's very interesting. And like, they're also like, I know a therapist in like in Charlottesville, where one of the things they do was like method acting or acting out situations. So instead of talking about the fight in the kitchen, act it out and don't use words, just show it and then talk about what you see in that. And it's interesting how what you're doing is, it's a kind of violence against your ordinary framing, which is a form of violence, and it's a violence against the violence to open something up, maybe like a clearing in a Heideggerian sense. So I really like that, and I think Jungle Speak Valentine's Day cards is going to be amazing. I will give it to Mr. Javier Rivera and Mr. Zach Fishman. Mr. Rivera, you want to do Jungle Talk? Anyone who talks now has to do Jungle Talk. Everyone from now on, Jungle Talk.
I really like that idea of Jungle Talk. I want to touch on this topic that Tom brought up about the consensual. You know what's funny about the violence that you could commit to a philosopher is ask him a question and say, it's either yes or no. It's either yes or no. Like, tell him that question and he will internalize that negativity to such a degree. He'd be like, no, but I have to tell you why. I have to tell you why I said yes or no. Right? The philosopher cannot let go of a simple, the violence of yes or no. Is it yes or no? Tell me now. So I think by Dimitri, and I think the same thing with the Jungle Talk. It's almost the same kind of violence as well, where we're so caught up on explaining that I have to confine myself to a kind of limit on something. And Chetan actually gave a pretty good anecdote about his relation with this girl, about him. Tell me if I misquote you, Chetan, where she said, "Don't say what you're thinking." Don't say what you're thinking. I actually encountered this a lot myself, right? Where the person asks me a question, they want to encounter something, and they go, "Look, I know you can run on about all the assumptions in this problem and everything else, but I just want to hear you. I just want to hear you speak on this topic. I don't want any reference to a philosopher. I don't want you to quote me anything. I don't want you to do anything." But in some ways, they are pointing out the unconsensual that happens with in our experience with the other. And so, but the thing that we don't realize, like Chachan was pointing out when he was younger, and I did the same thing. Like I did violence all the way to get to this point, to realize that I do violence every single day in all my interactions, was that every theory, any system of knowledge, I, for some reason, offload my responsibility to it when I am talking to another person, right? This is the kind of risk that a lot of kind of beginning thinkers don't realize, that you have found a way to off-put your responsibility of some kind of theory, some kind of philosopher, some kind of system of knowledge, and bringing it forth to somebody else. I think the only way that you can possibly, maybe, I mean, I don't think it answers the question of can we really have something, consensual interaction, but I think part of the process is realizing that when you present a kind of theory or a perspective based on your own philosophical reasoning via others, you have to understand that it's the burden of your responsibility, right? That you are, ironically, this leaning that you're doing on this kind of knowledge and understanding is actually not something that you are sort of offloading your responsibility in that sense, right? So you have to understand that there is a contradiction with responsibility, and Derrida actually talks about this very well, right? When we're asked the question of what do you do, right? If you're presented this question of what do I do in this scenario, and you refer to something else, they're just saying actually you are stripping away your responsibility, right? You're stripping away because you're leaning on something, you're depending on something for your decision. You're not actually being responsible. But of course, in my opinion, you can't escape this. We'll always lean on something. We're always utilizing some type of reasoning, some type of structure of knowledge to, so that's the kind of aporia with responsibility. There's so many ways that we're actually irresponsible by just simply leaning on a kind of structure of knowledge that we've encountered or read. And I can't address Ebert's point on the rejection of utopia. Why do we reject utopia? But I think it has to do with, at least I think part of the answer to the question has to do with freedom. Zizek actually talks about divine love and its tautology, meaning like, if everybody was in divine love, there would be no need to constrain evil because nobody would want to do evil. And so we get this question of why do we reject utopia? Well, I think it's because in some ways utopia has to be impossible to keep manifesting that chance, that encounter with love as such. At least some of the Buber and Rosenzweig kind of answer this too, where the messianic, the unity, the notion of unity, it always has to be a not yet unity. That's kind of what Buber and Rosenzweig kind of always point to, and you can see how even the violence of claiming a unity already is always, you can say, non-consensual. Especially when you're discussing it with another. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Excellent comment. I'll give it to Mr. Fishman and then Mr. Luba. And I thought we rejected Utopia because it has that creepy guy with the sleeping mask where he goes to the superstores and kills everyone in the Amazon series. But something about needing to reject it in order to create it is a lovely flip. I like that as well. There's also something about if you had Utopia, because unless we make perfect human beings, imperfect human beings in utopia would then have to reflect on themselves as unperfect in its presence, and then it could torture them. So, it's like if you're, there's some ideas that if you're in the presence of God and you hate God, then God is hell, right? Because you have to relate to a perfect entity you don't like. So then it's not that hell is God when you don't like him, right? And it seems like it's imperfect for human beings to be in utopia without reflecting on themselves as not liking the utopia, because it makes them encounter the real, which is their own finitude. So there might be something there with that. I also love the idea of posters where it says serial Boobian, watch out, everywhere he goes. He talks about Buber. So they have these pictures of Javier on the streets, like serial philosopher, be careful, lots of violence. I think it's great. And then the last thing I'll say is absolutely there's that citation conversation where instead of like thinking, you just cite people. You're like citing Hegel to avoid thinking Hegel per se, or citing philosophers so you don't have to think for yourself. So it's this like culture. So then it's like really dangerous that we have a culture where you're only allowed to think if you cite, because that's the exact opposite of thinking really, and offloading responsibility to what you can cite. And that's where I think when Hegel basically says look up at the beginning, like in the preface, or look on, where there's a sense where he's basically, a way I take that is like, don't read me until you can resist the temptation to offload to me. Like, don't read me until you can resist the temptation to then making me who you think through. But then ironically, because he does that, he tends to do really good philosophy that you reference all the time. So then you're like, oh gosh, maybe I'm offloading to him, right? So there's always this tension where you then have to judge your own quality and your own motivations and different things. So it's all fun, the abyssal choice. But Mr. Fishman, how are you doing today, sir? And then I'll give it to Mr. Luber.
I'm doing good. Good to see you guys. So yeah, on this topic of language as violence, I think this is really important. That like how you frame a question is in many ways more important than how you answer it, right? This is like Noam Chomsky's whole thing, I think, if I understand correctly, that like if I say, do you support the war on terror? That's framing the actions of people in the Middle East in a certain way, right? If I say, do you support invading sovereign countries and killing innocent people, that's framing those same actions in a completely different way, right? And it elicits a whole different response, a whole different discourse around the subject, right? And so it's like, you could take something like abortion, right? People say, do you believe in a woman's right to choose? And then somebody else will say, well, do you believe in protecting innocent life, right? And it's like, it's just two completely different conversations. And like how you frame it is everything, right? Because like the answer past that is almost irrelevant, right? If you can win the battle of how we frame the question, that's really going to determine how things unfold from there forward, right? And so to me, the question is like, how do we deal with this, right? And like one answer is to kind of like what Alexander was saying, you can invade the other and integrate them into your framing, right? So we have difference, and then you destroy that difference by integrating everybody into the same whole. But you can also have a unity which preserves difference, right? So that would be something like, rather than invading the other nation, you get together with the other nation and you establish clear boundaries and you create a law through which you can interact harmoniously, right? So you say, look, we have our thing over here, you have your thing over there. They're irreconcilable. We're not going to become the same thing ever. But can we come up with some way that we can relate to each other across that difference, right? So like with the abortion, it would be like, okay, look, you think this way, I think this way, but can we come up with a law that we can both agree on for how to deal with this, right? And once you do that, you can live together. So you can have the love, you can have the unity, but you can still engage in an intimate struggle, right? And I think that this is to answer the question of like, why do we do this absolute recoil once we have this sort of perfect integration? I think it's exactly that perfect integration is not utopia. Utopia is an intimate struggle across clearly defined boundaries. And I think that like we're not meant to, because the perfect integration is a return to the womb, right? And that's not what we're meant for. We are not meant to return to the womb and have a perfect integration. We are meant to become husbands and wives and have an intimate struggle across that divide, right? And so that's what I think about all this. I'll just leave it there.
That was hot. You had all these sexy, succinct poetry lines there, Mr. Fishman. That was nice. I'm going to hand it to Mr. Luber. There's a way in which a problem with some of those framings is there a framing that avoid risk? Because if I say, do you support murdering babies? You can't say yes. There's no risk there, right? Because it's like self-evident. But if you frame, do you support a woman's right to decide if it's murdering babies or not? well, there's a little bit more of a risk in the framing there because there's a certain like, well, if I say yes and it is murdering babies or something, then, oh gosh, I'm supporting like murder, right? But then you say, but wait a minute, if a woman says that it's not a human, then there's no murder there. So you're framing it, but no one puts it that way because we don't want to talk about the philosophy stuff because that's how you don't get invited to parties and everyone sees you at a serial boobian or risker. So there's interesting, I really like that point on the framing of the question. Often is like more important than the question itself or the answering of the question because it already assumes a certain framing. And it's interesting to think of framings that resist risk or don't open up risk taking and framing that does in something. But let me give it to Mr. Luber and then I'll give it to Mr. Alexander Ebert.
So yeah, that was really good. I want to push back on the notion of when you were citing. So like I guess I just have my experience in LA where people will not listen to you if it's not coming from a place of authority. So if I am just saying what I think without citing some authority, then it's like, who the heck are you? Who are you telling me that? Like, but once you are of some authority, which like that, I think what is authority? But if you are saying the same sentiment but through the lens of an authority, then in my experience they'll listen. It's interesting, I guess, depending on the context in which you're embedded in, how it's like, well, if in this philosophical context, if you're just constantly citing other people, then it's like, well, are you even a philosopher or are you just a large language model? Like but in the context of like LA, it's like they rather you be a large language model than you be your own thinker, honestly. But and then yeah, I just want to, language is violence. To me, this whole notion is like super Heideggerian. Like I've written a whole story where basically you're reading the script, there's no dialogue for about 80% of the time. And then right when the climax happens is when you actually hear the first, like when the climax sequence like begins, essentially, that's when you actually start hearing like the dialogue for the first time, because that is when like, I say the cause are like shows its face, but basically that which creates the situation reveals itself. And in that revealing itself is when you feel the need to talk. Like that, I think, is a very Heideggerian point. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. And then this whole concept of like consent, to me, actually reminds me of Shannon's information theory. Like in the sense that I got sound, I got color. They got to consent to a certain degree in order for me to actually have a sense of what they are for my own like phenomenological like position. So the question in Shannon's information theory is like, how are like X, Y, Z are all coming together in a cohesive way? And I think we kind of like already answered that, and it's like the intentionality, essentially, the how X, Y, and Z come together, how all the different perceptions, I mean, sensory perceptions come together, is all based off the intent in which their functionality is utilized. It's like those things only happen when their functions are utilized for the sake of some intention that me, the subject, is intending to capture, so to speak. So the question to me is, can that intentionality be like computational? Like, can that intentionality be, I mean, that's basically like what we've been struggling with art, so it's like, can that intentionality be, I don't want to say, not framed, but it's, can it be expressed in a way that given any context, you understand the consent in which the context is the context? Is there like an ultimate intentionality that accounts for basically all possible consent within a context? a given context.
Mm.
So, and I feel like I go back and forth. Like, I mean, it hurts my head because I sometimes think there is, sometimes I think there isn't. But yeah, I just wanted to.
You flip a
throw that out.
coin. We just flip coins. It's like
Right.
heads, tails, you know, the nature of reality change. It's great because the absolute choice in different things. Well, I'll pass it to Mr. Ebert. That was well said. And it makes me so, like, in some respects, the intentionality for Leibniz is the weaving principle. What is the principle that weaves things together? But in weaving things together, it weaves, like when you're mentoring color and shape, you're weaving these things together, which are different. And in weaving them together, they're brought together as similar in the very act that unveils their difference. So then there's a recoil. There's a pushing against. Colors and shapes are not the same,
Right.
and you have to hold it together. It's like, no, but they're similar, dang it. And if we don't hold it together, there won't be any ability to intellectualize or make sense of anything. And you're holding it as they're pushing against. And so maybe the philosopher's walking in and trying to weave situations where they're like, there's no philosophy here, so there's no clear ground or intention. That's why there's conflict. So someone needs to come and weave it together. And maybe that weaving can occur by moving into jungle speak instead of English. Did you have something real quick?
Yeah, real quick. Like within the situation of a story, that what weaves everything together is theme. So in my mind, can you extrapolate that into life itself?
Sure.
And that to me is the question. And then it's like, if you actually can, does that mean there is a God, or that there definitively is this source where that you're able to capture that theme, so to speak? And like we were talking about the other day, just like basically the religious dimension and the thematic dimension, and like that relationship, essentially, are they the same, are they different? But yeah,
sure.
I
call that the alterological choice. Ultimately, you see a thematic dimension, and then you choose religious or not, right? And that's kind of the alterological. But now I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. The last thing I'll say is, you were talking about characters. I love the story because in Chekhov, if there's a pistol, you got to make sure it shoots. So it's almost like your characters were Chekhov's pistol. It's like at one point they're going to talk, so don't have characters unless they talk. And when they talk, it has to be like not a misplaced shot, right? So characters are Chekhov pistols. Anyway, Mr. Ebert, and then Javier Rivera.
I'd like to propose the notion that if love is this unity, that it is more accurate to think of it as an event. So as opposed to thinking of war and love on this sort of equidistant gradient where they sort of interlope and interlace in some sort of liminal middle, that really we could think of this more in three parts. And to be totally Hegelian about it, you just think about it as repulsion and attraction as the basic experience. And I would basically call that sort of war. And then when attraction wins out, there's an event. That event is almost inevitably very momentary. It's phenomenologically distinct. The parietal lobe shuts off. You feel like you're in this state of oneness. You feel the unity. I think it's really important to always include phenomenology. So if we're going to say Alabama and California are in unity because they have laws, that's not really love. That's not the phenomenology of unity. The phenomenology of unity is an experience of the absence of difference. And I mean, if we're really talking about unity, right? So we should also think about, like, we're talking, I like this conversation about, like, oh, I can't speak Hegel at the party. And again, this is an issue of difference. Well, I'm being different, right? I experience this all the time. Like, oh, if I just start, oh, I'm starting to be too smart. Let me be a little more stupid because I need to be on the same vibration as the person I'm talking with. Otherwise, I'm going to offend them, make them feel weird, and they're never going to hang out with me again. So you create, and in Scientology, I am not a Scientologist. However, I had a Scientologist in my band. And when you grow up in LA, you know all about this shit. And I actually did do this like sweat lodge thing because I was really sick, and my Scientologist friend was like, I swear, dude, it's the best. So anyway, I went and I learned a lot of things. One of the things I learned was they have this thing called tones, right? And their whole thing is basically like how to win friends and influence people. That's Scientology in a nutshell. And one of their main things is creating tonal parity, whereas like, oh, this is you and you speak like that and you speak kind of low and you have this kind of inflection and you care about these things, match it. Match tones. You just match someone else's tone, and that's how you win friends and influence people, because it makes them feel safe, because it makes you feel like you are the same as them, right? Now, I can think to myself, if I want to, well, that's a really loving thing for me to do, right? I'm making someone else feel comfortable. But that also is obviating the status component, where I'm also winning friends and influencing people. And probably the real reason why I'm doing this, because I don't want to be on the outside of any clique. I want to feel loved by all. And so that aspect is always present, which means that even in those instances where you're trying to make someone feel comfortable, there's a certain element of not unity. And so if whatever's not unity is some variation or some gradient of war, I would call it sort of, this general field of war. And I think war is a very large gradient. And again, it's composed of attraction and repulsion, and it's composed of this tension between attraction and repulsion. And then once in a while, it collapses into love when attraction wins out, but that never really sustains itself. And again, one last thing, in the instance of two states, and yes, we're very different, but we're going to have a sort of unity. The only thing that I've ever seen where a unity or an accord is agreed to is based on some sense of fear and power parity with regard to power. So, for instance, if I'm some small, meek little town, and I'm like, I don't like the color red, and the big city's like, we love red, they're not going to strike an accord with me unless I have some fucking blackmail on the mayor's kids or something. Like, I have to create some kind of power parity there. It's war again. So even when there's an accord and we agree to live differently, there's some aspect of, because if we didn't, we'd be fucked. Or if we didn't, the price we'd pay would be too great, or something like that. So anyway, I think that I just want to present the idea that most everything is war on some level. You don't have to think about it. You think of it as attraction and repulsion, but it's not unity and it's not love. But love does happen. But we should always remember the phenomenology of love, as opposed to like, oh, that's love. It's like, is that love? Like, are they not only are they behaving like they're in unity, but are they in unity? And it's a rare occurrence. We have the desire for that experience. So, and which is, by the way, sort of a desire to the return to the sort of womb state. So we desire that, and that's, and so that once in a while it wins out, we experience it. But then, of course, when we have that inertia, we're also inert. We feel dead, and we have to leave it. So anyway, yeah, cool.
No, that was all excellent. I'll pass it to Javier Rivera, Zach Fistman, and Cheaton. And I was also going to note to what you were saying. There is a good one in saying you can't cite anyone. You've never read any philosophers. Who are you to speak? Because one of the problems is all these people like wanting to philosophize without reading. But then there's a ditch on the other side where you're just speaking those philosophies to avoid responsibility. But here's the issue: both of those are very similar. Both are similar in the case that you have a person that's read other philosophers, right? But when you bring them together, you start to see a difference, and that difference pushes them apart, but you have to bring them together into a mental situation to tell how they are not the same. Now, what you were saying on the event, Mr. Ebert, I think is exactly right. Leibniz talks about the situation. And the situation, he says there's basically no things, there's only situations. And that what happens is the situation is an act of like thing. So he says similar things are that which seem like the other when apart, that you have to bring together to realize that they're not the same. So similar things have to come together to unveil they're different. But of course, that's the horror. You're like, you go, oh, they're similar, they should be together. But it's exactly when they're in the same situation, either in actuality or mentally, that is the experience of the difference. So the similarity brings them together, like you're mentioning from the paper and then the quantum section, that then when they're in the same situation, pushes them apart. The difference comes out. And so then love is like, oh, I love this person. We're similar, so we should be together. And then you bring yourself together into the same situation, of which here's the key. You couldn't know the difference until you were together, because the whole idea of similarity is you can't know how they're different until they're together. right? That's why they're similar. You can't tell how they're different till they're together, but then you're together and you feel betrayed. You're like, I thought we were the same, dang it, and there's difference. But that's exactly what similarity does. Similarity is what creates the situation that unveils difference, and that sucks. But that's exactly what we need to experience the difference, so then we can negate, sublate it into something creative. And so thinking about like love and war, that's exactly right. Like you bring the things together, the very condition that love brings about is also the condition that unveils the difference of which become the grounds of war. So you have this,
there's really good real world examples of this. Like the left hates the left more than they hate the right. Like the left hates the liberal more than they hate the conservative. Yep. You know, you hate, and I experience the same thing. Like the people that associate me with the Burning Man people because I have a beard and stuff. Like I loathe Burning Man spiritualists more than I would loathe like a fucking like whatever. Sure. Like you name. And yeah, and so that like increased phenomena of difference is entailed and embedded within similarity. I just want to say citations are a great example of total war, and as Luber was saying, like, you know, you're basically bringing your cavalry with you. You know, it's a status play, and so, yeah, it's another good example of, yeah.
I mean,
right.
you know, LA is very status heavy, so it's just.
Oh yeah.
That's yeah.
Yeah, we dragged him over from LA to Virginia, and then he's finding out why are the offices 90 degrees? It's because we don't pay for air conditioning. But I'll pay Mr. Javier Rivera and Mr. Zach Fishman, please. So Javier Rivera, please tell us about how you're a serial philosopher and don't get invited to parties.
Well, I mean, you encounter this difference easily when you start entertaining love prospects, right? You know, the girl approaches you and says, "Please, I don't want to listen to your ranting about philosophy." But you know, I enjoy this violence too, because in some sense, I have to commit it at certain times. But then, you know, because then what happens is that if you permit the other to always not allow you to do this, then they never really get to really encounter you as a difference sometimes. So in this case, returning it is also can be beneficial, can also be harmful. So it's definitely a toss and toil with the idea. Now, I do agree with Ebert that love is kind of like an event. Buber talks about this. He talks about how it's an event, but also how it persists. And this is how he talks about how, and Badiou talks about this too. From this point on, after the event of love has sort of collapsed, it's now our responsibility as individuals to construct something together as two. Badiou and I would say Buber don't really disagree on this part. It fundamentally does kind of come down to constructing a worldview of two at this point. And always fighting off the oscillation of the selfishness that kind of arises always. And you could say this is always kind of like the war that's happening between a very personal relationship of two, is that we're constantly battling our own selfishness in correspondence to trying to build something and construct something as two. Now, to answer Luber's question, you know, is there a kind of mode? Is there a kind of for intention? In my experience of reading Buber, the only mode that I have discovered that even can give rise to this possibility is waiting. Waiting as a kind of intense internalization of negativity, because it's the only action that basically is not partial. It is a full embodied kind of mode of being. I would say I prefer it over letting, because letting, sometimes the term letting go is like, okay, I'm just releasing something and that's it. I'm just releasing something. But like waiting has a more personal, can have a more personal approach. I don't know if you ever, you know, we all hear the sentiment in our lives, right? I'll wait for you. I'm waiting for you, right? You tie your shoes, and somebody says, okay, I'll wait for you. You can see how waiting as a mode carries within itself responsibility, freedom, right? Freedom to allow the other to finally come and emerge, right? This waiting for you. I'm waiting for you. But this is also love as a kind of responsibility. You know, I'm waiting for you. And so this constant mode of waiting is, in my opinion, what always keeps the intention, or at least you try to attempt to keep the intention as consistent as possible. But you know, our notion of waiting is never like this. It's more like an impatient, ironic waiting. Like I'm waiting, I'm waiting, I'm waiting. You know, it's funny that people say I'm waiting, and it's probably the most impatient kind of grammar that we used against each other when we're talking to each other. The other thing about this Ebert talked about this, how love kind of has this quality of just a sameness. Buber talks about this to some extent, where love almost has no content, because to have content would actually reveal difference in some sense. And and I've always struggled with this idea. How can you know, love have no content? But what Buber is really trying to say is that you experience the other as other in its totality, that you're not reducing them to some type of qualitative experience of some sort. The other thing, God, I'm trying to find all the stuff that I put here. Oh yes, on dating. Actually, Ebert kind of brought this up too. There is this interesting oscillation between difference and you could say similarity or sameness. If you grant me conflating those terms, similarity and sameness. What I've noticed about like interactions with people, especially with difference, is that sometimes the responsibility is that you have to lack just enough. You have to lack just enough, because if you don't lack just enough, then you also negate your own otherness, because nobody wants to interact with you. And then you no longer, then, you know, you can never have an interaction with somebody else. So even with dating, right, you can't be so perversely different. You have to lack, in some sense, just enough to have that attraction and experience. And then the last thing on unity, Buber actually makes a very interesting argument on unity, where he says the experience of love is not a unity between two, but it's when somebody has united themselves, that has allowed, it's a unification of the self that has allowed the other to emerge, which is a very interesting argument, because he places unity in a different spot, in a different location. Of course, I have, I mean, experience-wise, I have a really hard time, like, you know, I feel like interpretively I could find everything that negates that conception that Buber's talking about, but because he makes such a distinction between feelings and typically experience are associated with feelings, you know, he argues against this. So it's sometimes a question, how phenomenological is it really when Buber talks about this? But that's just my own gripes with him. Yep, all right, on there.
Beautiful, Javier Rivera. I'll give it to Mr. Fishman, then Chetan. It's interesting, to Mr. Luber's point on the information theory. You're taking shape, color, difference, creating a similarity, and then there's the other of apple, right? Like you bring things into similarity and then an other. So there's like a condition of unity that gives rise to the other. You see that in the Leibniz weaving. That's very interesting. And then I really like the point where he's like waiting. But then if I go waiting, like it's a negation of the negation, but the opposite of the negation, instead of sublation, it's like you started with the negation and now you've turned it into the dick. You're a dick. So, you know, so it's interesting how waiting is the opposite of negation of the negation, perhaps. But let me pass it Mr. Highroot and then Mr. Chetan.
Yeah, so I guess I would like to push back against the idea that love is the absence of difference. And like the whole idea of an accord between separate identities can only be sustained through fear. That brings back what Dimitri was saying like an hour ago about how love across, like if there's a difference in power, a difference in status, etc., between two lovers, that their love something's dead about it, right? In order to be fully alive within the love, there does have to be equality on that sense, because otherwise, like Alex was saying, it's just a matter of submission, right? And love, like, I think you bring a good point here, Alex, that like we have to remain in the phenomenological and not merely talk about like abstractions and nation states and things like that. But phenomenologically, to me, love is not like, oh, we're the same. Love is like, I know who I am and you know who you are, and I respect you and you respect me, and we're able to be together within that difference. And I think that if love is merely this sort of collapse into a sameness, that's like, it's just not going to make a relationship work. You know what I mean? Because you can have that moment in sex, right? Like occasionally you can sort of have this ecstatic of like, oh, we're totally united, but then it's going to fall apart and the differences are going to be revealed. And if you can't bring love into that difference, then I don't see any hope of maintaining a relationship. And so I would just stand on love being a matter of intimacy across boundaries, not a dissolution of boundaries, because otherwise we can't have a world. Like, the world is bounded, you know what I mean? We don't live in an infinite world, right? We are not God, you know what I mean? We have limitations, and limitation means difference, and that difference will preserve no matter what you do in your relationship. And so if you can't bring love into difference, then that's the end of relationship. And all that's left is the sameness of being isolated, because you're just gonna have to break apart and be the same within yourself. And so, so that's kind of I don't know, maybe I'm being a little harsh here, but that's what I have to say.
Oh no, well, I'll give it to Mr. Ebert to reply. And you don't want to live in a blob world, like a giant blob? That doesn't work for you in different things? Well, I think it gets into sameness, like the kind of phenomenological commitment to a certain being in the same tension of weaving together difference into a similarity that always has a conflict going on. So there's this weird thing in the event of the movement between what these are like. But let me let Mr. Ebert reply, and then we'll give it to Chetan. And then back to you if you would like, Mr. Fishman.
Oh, just a couple of things, and then I'll respond directly. So actually, in my view, and also mathematically, and I think just operationally, limitation, ironically, is what allows self-sameness to occur within the limitation itself. So limitation, without limitation, we cannot achieve a saturation. So you need a boundary in order to saturate a space. And it is actually that process of saturation which creates the phenomenology or the phenomenological experience, in my view, this is what I've been constructing lately, of sameness. But we shouldn't think of it as you are the same as me, because then you've still identified a difference. By sameness, what I'm really talking about is a feeling of infinitude, a feeling of dissolution of the self, a feeling of sort of indeterminacy. And that indeterminacy, again, occurs within the saturation. So, you know, you circumscribe the couple, and it's like, it's me and you, and then it's me and you, and me and you, and me and you, and you saturate that space, you saturate that limitation to the point at which it's so saturated that the difference between, like, it's so congested with me and you that the difference between us momentarily can evaporate. And it's at that very moment when these, like as Hegel would call it, true infinity occurs. And you can see this in a, like, if you go on desmos.com, which is a great little math app, and you put in like sine 1 over x, and you see the waveform, and it goes, and it's like, literally, this is like what creates the troughs and the peaks. Repulsion, attraction, repulsion, attraction, repulsion, attraction, repulsion, and all of a sudden the attraction's starting to win out, and the oscillations are getting closer together, and then all of a sudden they collapse. And at that point, mathematically, we call that undefined, but that full collapse into an actual unity between the oscillations. So you had these oscillations that were different from one another, and then they collapse into sameness, and that moment actually occurs at the limit, you know? So it's these limits that actually, like, that we flood up against and that create those moments. And similarly, the the experience of like ontological flooding, which exceed the limitations of our cognition, are exactly those moments of awe, which throw us into states of, wow, oneness or whatever. We exceed ourselves, so we exceed our capacity. So again, limits are required for this feeling of unity, or the transcendence of the self, or the indeterminacy of self, where the parietal lobe may shut off and we don't any longer have our sense of place and time. We're just sort of present, and all these sorts of things. But I do like what you're saying about the love being able to persist within the difference as difference. And I'm just trying to like think back to my own phenomenology of like being in love, and the experience of like really loving someone and seeing them as them, and that feeling of like excitement and replete sort of saturation with that feeling of them. And I'd have to think a little further on like what that really feels like. But my first inclination is just to say that the feeling when it's not, when the feeling is that they're resonating at a different level than you, or whatever the case, and you're in love, that's pure pain, right? Because then that's like, if only, I hope this works out. I really want, like, I want this to work out. And it's like that constant heartbreak. There's something when the sameness is there, when they're looking into your eyes and you're looking into their eyes, and they say, you know, they feel like you see them and you feel like they see you, and they don't see me as like, oh, Alex Ebert, the musician guy, and I don't see them as like, oh, so-and-so, the so-and-so. They see the total package. They see the indeterminacy of me. They see the I feel indeterminate and they feel indeterminate. They seem infinite and I seem infinite. And there is a correspondence which actually is mathematically isomorphic. We are the same. I see your God and you see my God, and because those are indeterminacies, they are likewise infinite, and because they're infinite, they're likewise totally isomorphic. I mean, correspondent down to every single point in me corresponds to every single point in you, and that's the feeling of being in love to me. And there is still, even though you see that they're other, it's an isomorphism. There is a direct sameness that's occurring in that moment.
Very well said, Mr. Ebert. No, it's a fascinating, where precisely the moment of the realization of infinity is the realization of a sameness that you can resonate with, but then there's another infinity. So there's a certain difference that of me merges in the sameness that then creates, I think, might point to certain absolute recoil. And then it thinks on Leibniz. So I think this is very important. Please.
And your thing, A equals B. This is what that's what I just described,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
It's like when set A literally is isomorphic to set B.
Yes.
That's love. That's the moment of like the experience of that.
Yes, and I will describe a Leibniz situation that I found really helpful, but that's excellent. I'll give it to Chitan and then Javier Rivera, and then as we come up at the end, if anyone final things, please. That's very good.
I think I sort of want to take the Zach's and Ebert's sort of discussion. I was remembering the Banchik's quote, and I actually found it, where she says, and I just put it in the chat, she says, they also, whether we speak of reproduction, union of two different cells, of love in all its various forms, or of all great sublimation such as art, go out of their way and embrace some alterity, difference, the other, or at least a scent of the other. Pleasure in the Freudian sense, on the other hand, needs no other. The other is rather disturbing to it. So there is this contrast between pleasure and love that sort of in Freud sort of emerges, where love emerges at the point where you sort of embrace difference. The same in Deleuze also. Deleuze sort of sees the repetition difference in the same manner. There's a way, but Ebert has a point. There is a point at which repetition embraces difference. At what is at that point, meeting point, which is what I think Ebert is sort of trying to hint to us, that that there is a point where repetition and difference meet together, and we can have a sort of discussion, But love has this strange property that it goes to the end of difference where repetition meets with difference in that sense. For instance, when you say something like man is man, first man automatically becomes different from the second man because both meaning of both men is the same. There will be no meaning of the sentence in that sense. There's something about that thing that radical repetition leads to radical difference in nature. What is it about that? I think that's the first thinking. The other is that sameness actually is a different problem, because sameness doesn't need to presuppose equality or union. Classic example comes from Hannah Arendt's work, where she sort of points out that when people labor together, so even factory workers, if you remember, factory workers sort of bring songs. They have to sort of put their metabolism into one rhythm. Where two becomes one. It isn't labor that two becomes one. There is a sort of a union which is not a union in that sense, where we all act as one. When women cook in the kitchens, you can see that. When you labor in farmlands, if you've seen farmers work together in farmlands, it is there they have to sort of connect their rhythm with everybody else. And their two is functioning like one. It happens in mostly private domains. It happens in situations where you are isolated from the other person, and yet you have to work with that person. In that sense, one becomes two in the public political domains. That's the other side of it, where when you have to act in this world, action or speech presupposes acting in concert, where I have to accept me and you are different and yet act on your behalf. There's something about speech politics which has to sort of take that. Arendt sort of makes that distinction very interesting, that two becomes one in labor and one becomes two in action. Action is always plurality. Labor is, in some senses, this, unity, that however, she thinks about that thinking. So I think the problem with sameness is that sameness doesn't need this presupposition of equality. Action does, where two people are different. It is there you need presupposition of equality to bring that distinction of A is equal to B. There is some equality that has to be presupposed when there is difference over there. If they're completely same, you don't need to presuppose any equality. Equality has no function there. Equality's function emerges when there is some difference. And that's extremely interesting of Arendt to point it out. I was just reading it the other. That's, I think, the second point, that sameness is something which is very privative, which is very, and love, of course, oscillates between these two extremes, which is why love can become extremely private and love can become extremely public in that sense. And that's why I think Ebert is trying to capture, I think, this movement love has between these two, positions, and at what point love becomes love and what point becomes less than love. Those discussions, sentimentalism and all of those words that we use for it, and that those discussions we can have. I think the last point around this question of sameness is that sameness, that I think Ebert said it also, that violence becomes much higher when two things are similar to each other. If the two things are some distinct with each other, you don't need extreme violence. Extreme violence comes from certain kind of resonance, certain kind of similarity, which is why you see most violent wars are between certain similar domains. So I don't think sameness can ever be escaped from violence. That is, I think, one point which we need to rethink in that sense, that sameness is quite often a site of violence. But I don't, and I think, how do we think through this question of sameness and resemblance becomes, so I think things will always resemble each other, no matter how different they are to each other. Radical difference involves some kind of repetition embedded into it. But at what point same things, by virtue of them being same, start differing from each other? That also is a point that you have to think about. Just by virtue of, you put two same people, you put two same objects, at some point they will start differing with each other. At some point they have to start asserting their own difference. And what is that tendency on the other side, I think, Yeah, thanks.
The distinction between action and labor is excellent to incorporate, and everything you were saying about the sameness is beautiful. I'm going to pass it to Javier Rivera and Mr. Alexander Ebert. Beautifully said, Chetan.
I think Ebert addressed the question pretty well to Zach. But I would like to just echo some things. The Ebert's example of this oscillation, right, where the repetition can oscillate so fast that finally it just becomes like basically a straight line. It becomes undefined. For me, if love is the event, it's also the beginning and the end, right? But I understand where Fishman is coming from, because where he's coming from is a critique of what Buber had called mystical unification, mystical love, right? Where you get so enraptured in this ecstatic feeling that you just never return, right? And so by that sense, you completely disregard the other, because the moment that love as an event happens, it also dissipates, right? It cannot. And so what do we mean? So I think there's this twofold action, and we can use Ebert's example here, where it actually takes work to get to this oscillation. We have to work to get to this oscillation point. Of course, this is what I call waiting. I'm waiting because the event of love, the tautology of love, was that I was already in love when it happened, right? In fact, sometimes you can even say ironically that when you realized post hoc that you are in love, you have already been in it. And so in that moment, it's also ironically the end of it as well, right? This is the event of love. And from then on, the event of love has both changed these two individuals, right? But because we find out that we love each other, we now have to construct something together as two. And I feel like this is what Fishman was trying to get at, that it's a construction of difference now between two. Love has brought us together. Now we have to construct again. But also in the midst of waiting as a kind of mode, as a kind of like, because I have experienced love with you, I'm also waiting for you. This is the construction that we are doing together. We're both waiting. And there is that chance that you can experience that event again. And I think this is why repetition is also important, that we are waiting to again have love as an event. But in efforts to have love as an event again and again, you have to construct this difference between two. And so I definitely agree with you, Fishman. Some of the dangerous concepts about love is always is that a lot of the romantic notions about love is that they never move away from love as event. They never move this away. They think, oh, you are this, how come you changed, right? This wasn't the same, and they have a hard time moving on. They don't know how to basically construct after the event. This is the problem with, again, I still think love is an event, but it's twofold. It's the event, if we want to use time, we could say, oh, event is this cut in time where we experience something. Perhaps, but maybe the event is also the construction of it, right? This waiting, this mode of waiting. So we don't have to divide this notion of love as event and love as construction. It is, in my opinion, both the same grounds in some sense. The notion that Chetan brought up about pleasure is something very similar that Buber brings up about feelings. That feelings, and this is the confusion, feelings always accompany the experience of love. But what's dangerous about feelings for Buber is that feelings change. And because feelings change, it's always unequal. It's always asymmetrical, right? You can always, your feelings can always change day to day with this person that you are in love with. So this is why Buber again focuses love as a kind of responsibility. And this is where I kind of swallow everything into my notion of mode of waiting, because mode of waiting is because I experienced this event, but I am waiting for you now, right? And we're constructing together as a waiting. but it's a waiting that I must continue to take action. I must continue to take responsibility. I must continue to construct something with you, and so on. And then a last brief note, because Chitan quoted Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is also quoted by saying Buber is the guide to the youth. So that's my little tie-in there, but I'll finish there.
Oh, he's looking for a citation endorsement. You're supposed to think for yourself, Javier. You know, we don't need endorsements here, all right? So, no, there is something about a bird landed on my shoulder when I stand in this field, so I'll keep standing in this field because there's the possibility of the bird landing again, but maybe you're just a crazy person now. So waiting, you know, waiting brings that risk, which is interesting too. But let me give it to Mr. Alexander Ebert and then Luber, and then if Chitan, you'd like to speak again, please.
If I forget, someone remind me that I wanted to bring up my father. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about sameness, inspired by some things Chitan was saying, and also to clarify that the sameness that I'm referring to, and I think that we're all referring to when we talk about love, is, again, this sort of correspondence of indeterminacies. So I just want to talk briefly about, I want to see if I can make this connection between the determinate sameness, which isn't love, and the indeterminate sameness, which is. So if I show up to school, or my kid shows up to school, or a kid, I don't want to put her on Front Street. So a kid shows up to school, and she decided to wear that day a red shirt. And she sees another kid show up to school, and that kid also decided to wear the same red shirt. Now we have a determinate sameness. Is that love? Not necessarily. But now let's consider the same exact object representing an indeterminacy. So you see that the kid is wearing the very same red shirt that you chose to wear. And then you ask the question, or you suddenly feel this sense of, did they choose to wear it for the same reason that I chose to wear this? Are we the same in some indeterminate way that I can't really describe? And there, suddenly, you have a correspondence that is within the scope of that event. But it requires the move from determinate sameness to indeterminate sameness. And again, you know, I always like bringing back to this set theoretical thing where any indeterminacy, no matter how small and contained, and these determinate indeterminacies can occur within finite spaces, saturated finite spaces, like the point where the oscillations lap over each other, is isomorphic to any big infinity you can think of, the real numbers, you name it. So the space between 1 and 2 is isomorphic to the entire real number line. And that's amazing, right? So anyway, then I wanted to bring it briefly, so indeterminacies of sameness, bring it to because that would be weird if it was like, oh no, we have the same shoes, we're in love. So I want to talk about my dad. So do I love my dad? I'm thinking about this. Like, I don't know if I love my dad in the same way that I'm describing love as an event right now. And I'm thinking about this. And I'm aware of one of the, I called him last night. I check on him from time to time. I'm going to go visit him with my daughter because I think that would be a cool thing for her to get to see him again, because he's getting really old and I don't know what's going on. He just fell. He's like 90. He had me late. We have a very sordid history. But the thing that Javier was just referring to with regard to, you have this kernel of experience. And then almost like rhizomatically, all the things that expand out of that event are extensions of that event. And I agree with that, even though they might not be within the phenomenology of love and they might not be within the event itself. They're sort of repercussions of the event. But we refer back to the event, like I remember, as a way of persisting the construction So I had this amazing experience with my baby mama. We kissed for the first time and literally stars exploded. And it was like, I thought I was hallucinating, but then she was like, are you getting this? And I was like, oh my God, you see it too? Talk about a sameness and a correspondence. It was like, that's it. And actually, that's when we started screaming, that's it. That's it. We were in the middle of Lake Michigan. We just started screaming, that's it. That's it. That was it. It was the beginning and the end. That's it. And so we knew we were going to have a kid and whatever, and everything started to fall apart slowly, of course, right? All the real world shit came in, but we would always refer implicitly or even explicitly to that moment and know that that moment necessitated all of the subsequent construction. And not only necessitated it, like got us through. It's like, why are we together? Oh, right, the event. Now with my father, what are my events? Well, when I was a kid, he was larger than life. I don't know, like there's something about my dad and the experiences we had. There's something about it. Now with my mom, it's easy. I came through her vagina. That's an event. But with my dad, like, I don't know, you know? But then there's these moments, so there's this thing, and then there's this idea of fatherhood. There's this idea of having a father. There's the idea that I didn't get to hang out with my grandparents enough because they died early, and my kid could hang out with her grandparent. And so those ideas, they have these limits. They're circumscribed. I have them. They're like these determinate ideas that I keep filling. And at the moment, still, it's work. It's a construction that isn't phenomenologically driven by a love, but it's toward something. It's like almost like the thing that I get in my mind is after he dies, imagining that feeling of a sufficient saturation having occurred. And that's what I want. I want to get that sufficient saturation of father-sonness so that when he dies, I don't feel like I blew it, you know, or whatever the case. And so that, you know, that sort of, that event of like a cumulative event, I guess we could call it, and an event almost in hindsight, because when you're a kid, you're not like, I'm in love with my dad. You're just, but later, like there's an accumulation of event that can occur through an accumulation of memory that can cause a sort of event-like moment. And I'm just working through this in real time, but yeah. What is love when it's with your dad or your mom, or like what is that, and where is the event? You know, it's a cop out to say the birth, really, but like, where's the event? And I feel like there's some kind of cumulative memory thing there, at least in my experience, where I'm able to sort of compress all these memories into this relationship, and that is sort of my event. And I would say that my event isn't through. I'm building an event. That's what it is. I'm building an event, and it probably is going to occur before he dies, or maybe it'll be the moment he dies, but I'm building that event. I'm accumulating as much as I can before that limitation occurs, where his life expires. And that is what I'm hoping will be my fucking in love with my dad event, you know, my moment that carries forth for me. So I'm trying to like accumulate as much experience as I can for that event. That's what it feels like.
No, that's beautiful. And it makes me think that for events, there's some kind of eventing, some kind of work of eventing that you're building up for the event. And then you have to do the work to keep the event eventing. And it's like it has to transition to a kind of action that occurs. So there's eventing, which is kind of the action of the event. And maybe that's kind of also bringing together the waiting, the event, because we talk about an event like you're walking down the street and a lightning bolt, there's an event, but there's really this kind of eventing that then makes an event that then breaks through, and then you have to do the work of eventing like from that event and referencing back and keeping it alive. So it's interesting to think of event versus eventing as a certain language. But that was beautiful, Mr. Ebert, and I'll pass to Mr. Lubert, then Chetan, and we'll come up on the close here. Mr. Lubert.
That was great. I really love this back and forth between, I guess, what like Fishman was saying in regard to what you were saying, Ebert. Because I mean, personally, like when I guess when the event here started, I was on the side of Fishman, quite frankly, but I understood what like you were saying. To me, it's like in a story, you have your main character in a state called A, and that main character remains to be the main character throughout the entire story, but ends up in a different disposition, call it B. So how is it the case that the characters moves in a way where they remain the same and yet are different, like by the end of the story? And that to me paralleled with like the notion of love is the story itself, the theme, or and to use like Heidegger language, it's Dasein. It's the very fact that you are working and building within being there, and that your work has to do with being there. Like being there is the constant. It is what brings together all difference in a certain sense. So it makes sense to me that you need to see how you're both present with each other, and then realize that we are both different insofar as we got to the point of realizing that we're present together from a different starting place. And because it's always from that different starting place, what happens is the second you realize, like what you were saying, like this is it. I love that story. Like what Javier's saying, like the second it's realized, it's over. Like it's over because you then have to realize, okay, what will essentially, like the anticipation's over because it's realized. So like in a movie sequel, like there's still the first one. It still needs to have that end, but it's an end insofar as there's something subsumed in the very story itself that gives credence to another anticipatory state. In other words, a different story where I could be anticipating over basically the same story. And well, not the same story, the same topic, so to speak. So it's like for me, waiting, like how Javier is talking about it, is I just substitute it with anticipation. Like when I'm watching a movie, it's like, what am I waiting for? Like there's an aggressive aspect to recognizing that you're anticipating, and that is that you are like Franz Bonetto, a random philosopher in the 1800s. He has a famous line that he says, if he wants to know, I mean, if he knows, what he knows is because he wants to know. And the very act of knowing is all based off of how your anticipation is oriented to the particular set of basically the values in relation to the context in which you're oriented toward. And I lost my thought, but I guess another thing I wrote down here is that this conversation of like difference and sameness or harmony, however you want to like phrase it, it's how I think of tone. Like when I'm creating a tone in a story, it's it's the difference rubbing against the very fact that it's caught within the harmony of presence. Like a real tone, like to really get at something where it's like an uncanny tone, where you're on the edge of your seat, is based off the fact that how is this difference relating to the presence itself, and not knowing how it's relating, and not knowing how it's not relating is what is the anticipation that keeps you going in the story. So I hate so many Hollywood BS movies where it's just like one tone. It's just one tone. It's like I can guess what's going to happen because it's like it's not multi-toned in the sense that it's not reaching the depths of an uncanny dimension of the story where it's like how is what how's the feeling or the way the presentation relating to the presence? Like having the ability to create a presentation where it's not clear why that presentation is relating to how it's present in the moment is what creates a good tone. And then a good story is just bringing the relation together at the end and seeing, oh, okay, plot twist, or the causer essentially reveals itself and is like, I understand why this tone makes sense. And I love it. I love this unique tone because it is fitting the requirements for making something present, while at the same time showing that within that presence, within the unfolding of that presence, there is a difference that is to be discovered of why it's different within that very unpresent. I mean, within that very presence. Yes.
Beautifully put. Because, well, so part, and I'll give it to Chiton and Mr. Fishman, is that if the tone is the same throughout the entire story, then you can't tell if it's the anticipation that is the same throughout, and therefore the unifying principle, or the tone. So there's ambiguity. So then you won't say there's anything dynamic. It brings to light Mr. Ebert's work on the noise wars and the lack of dynamicism in music and different things. If it, like, when there's a variance in tone, if the anticipation is constant in the story, then that means there is a sameness that is running through that underlines the difference. So this is the weird thing, and then I'll pass it on. Like what Mr. Fishman is saying is that in love, there's an unveiling of difference, but then the unveiling of difference also corresponds with a feeling of sameness. So sameness and difference come together in a situation that has a absolute recoil structure to it, that Leibniz will talk about situation. So there's this weird thing that occurs. And that has to be described. I think is very important, but let me give it to Chiton and Mr. Fishman. Oh, I was also going to say, like with Bonetto, there's a way of, like, the difference between knowing and absorbing is like you want to know. And so you know it, otherwise you just absorb. And so there's this interesting thing on why is that want to underline the knowing as opposed to absorb. But then if you want to turn something you've absorbed into knowing, you have to want to understand it more. So there's always this interesting like play, and that gets into will, want, free will, and theology, and lots of fun stuff. But let me give it to Chiton, then Mr. Fishman.
I think now once you know Ebert sort of puts it like indeterminate sameness, I think Zach's and Ebert's position become very similar now in that sense. Now they can really talk, because the indeterminacy actually corresponds to or already presupposes an alterity. Because if there is no alterity, sameness cannot happen. If sameness is already there, it becomes determinate, as Ebert is saying. It's because of the indeterminacy, sameness happens. And there's a great joy in finding yourself in places you least expect to. In fact, one can argue more indeterminate the sameness, the more stronger the event would be, probably. The more indeterminate the sameness would be, the stronger its force can be. In that sense. So there alterity plays a key role in structuring that sameness then. Then it's not the sameness of labor as we were discussing, or pleasure as Freud would put it. No, the narcissistic, egoistical. It's a different kind of texture of that sameness becomes very different in that. So that is why you can think back to the opposition of sameness and resemblance that we sort of discussed in that sense. And so one can easily see that there are two kinds of sameness, one that cancels difference and the other that sort of completely affirms difference. And these two things that meet at some point, which is, I said, radical repetition meets radical difference. When something repeats radically, it creates, the event becomes at that point, because the whole background in which that repetition has to be interpreted becomes different. That is where the event comes into picture. Till the point repetition is not radical. It changes, it brings small changes within the structure of repetition such that the background remains the same. That's the tension. But once you can repeat something radically, the background in which it is being interpreted changes. That is the event. And you build up to the event slowly by making that repetition more and more honest. The repetition, the more background starts shifting. And you reach a sort of a point where background gives away. Background says that I can't hold this repetition anymore. And now I am not there to give this repetition its meaning. Now you have to give that meaning from a different point. Now I will not hold this, like a dam. I will not hold this water anymore, in some senses. And now you need different boundaries for this water to flow. And at once, at least the water will completely bridge apart. It will completely push and put its force upon you, and then you can create new boundaries for it. That's the event in that sense, and that's where I think something interesting sort of comes out. Yeah.
Well, I know we gotta run here. This has been a really good conversation. I do think that my point of view and Alex's have kind of reconciled to some degree over the course of this conversation. And I think a lot of this could just come down to a matter of definition. And like when it comes to the whole like sameness difference, and then like sameness with determinacy versus sameness with indeterminacy, like to me it gets a little bit confusing. I guess like I would return to the phenomenological here, and say that like there is the experience. To me, what Alex was describing, I would call ecstasy, right? Where it's like this moment of just like, oh, just like every total saturation, right? And this is, this can happen in sex. This can happen, if you smoke DMT, you will experience this kind of just like total, everything's just like, whoa, and there's no me and you, there's no distinction. Everything's just like, whoa, this is awesome, right? But then, like, to me, that's not, I wouldn't call that love. I would call that ecstasy. And I think that ecstasy is very important. And like it plays a crucial role in our lives. And what it does is it kind of sets us on a different trajectory, right? It's like you're going in this one way, and then you have this ecstatic moment, and then you go in this other way because of that, right? But love is the way that you go after that moment. You know what I mean? To me, love is more like, you're at a family dinner and somebody says something that just like gets on your nerves. You just want to explode at them, but then you look around the table and you think, oh, these are my family and I love them, and so I'm going to be loving to them, right? And it's a struggle. Like it is a wrestling with difference, because the difference is gonna pain you. Like Alex said, that to recognize that somebody you love is on a different wavelength than you is painful. But love is what endures through that pain and bears that pain, and maybe doesn't reconcile it ever. You know what I mean? Maybe you just live with that pain. You know what I mean? But that's love to me, and is distinct from ecstasy. It's not a saturation. Saturation is turning the brightness all the way up on the screen, so there's only white. You know what I mean? Whereas love preserves the colors. And so that's all I got to say in closing. Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful conversation.
That was beautifully put, Albie. It makes me think of like where people say philosophy starts in wonder, but do we want to say that philosophy is just wonder? It's like philosophy is the wondering, like the event ing. There's some sort of ing you have to add where, yeah, sure, if you don't have the wonder, if you don't have the ecstasy, you may not be able to get into ecstasying as love or something. So there's some sort of movement that's strange, because the ecstasy is contained in the love, in the inging. The wonder is contained in the philosophy, in the inging, but then it's not equivalent, and yet it is somehow relating. It has some sort of carrying with. And that's that kind of interesting thing where there's distinction, and yet distinction affirms a sameness, a constancy of the wonder being there in the philosophy. And yet in the inging, it's not the same. And that's that weird change. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera.
Ebert's notion about where's the locality of the event of love with son and father. What's funny about what I just said before about the event of love also being the beginning and the end is that once you realize post hoc about this realization, is that actually you realize that you knew nothing about love. That's when you say, oh, that's it. That's it. This is it. Right? But you had to have known nothing about love for you to encounter that this is it moment. And so the question of the locality of love is that it's always, in some sense, indeterminate. That the event always reminds you that you know nothing about it. That's why you can have it as a kind of event, as a kind of saturation of indeterminacy that Ebert is talking about. And this is also the ironic position of waiting, too. That when you experience love as an event, that you did not know that you have been waiting. You had not known that you had been waiting for this person for you to encounter them. You had no idea. This is when waiting turns into a surprise. When you had no idea that you have sort of persisted in your life, made decisions, and so on, and then all of a sudden this event happens. right? And then all of a sudden you keep thinking about all your notions about love and your understanding about love, and then the event happens and you see, I know nothing about love, because if I knew something about love, then I would not be attracted to this person right now. Right? There's something about love that always subverts our own notions about it, and then we realize that we know nothing about it. But then what ends up happening is that the eventing obscures our notions, because we end up carrying some notion of that event within us. And that's the sort of negativity and sublimation that Dimitri was talking about, that he feels like love is ultimately about sublimation. That actually what ends up happening is that the eventing is the fact that we have to carry these notions about the event, and through our construction of two, we're constantly negating each other's notions and rising them up, and yet at the same time it is still love, that the event itself does not know that it is always eventing.
Beautifully put, Javier. And I think that points to how in Hegel you require determinations that you will find out are not complete precisely to get to the place where you can find out they are not complete. And you actually never knew the thing, you only knew determinations of it. So there's an intentional failure that makes possible unfolding. And this is the structure of things. That is very, very strange, but seems important. For Leibniz, which I think Hegel shares in, he almost wants to, he's kind of weary of the term metaphysics, and he almost wants to talk about metageometry, because basically everything we are describing about the coordinates of sameness, similarity, difference, relation, situation, for Leibniz, that is the material of metaphysics. And the problem with the term metaphysics is it creates the impression that you're describing things, or just things, as opposed to coordinations of situations, which ultimately even an apple is a coordination of the color red, the shape of round, and there's a coordination to create a situation of apple. And so what we've been getting at here for Leibniz, and I think Hegel completely agrees with this, is that one of the reasons metaphysics has not been useful for thinking is because we have not thought of it in terms of a meta-geometrical. I think Deleuze was getting back to something more meta-geometrical. I think Hegel was, and they're talking about, for Leibniz, the term is situation. Now, it's also quite interesting because in your example where you're talking about the person wants to hear what you have to say, not what Hegel has to say, isn't there a way in which you say, but I am my readings of Hegel. And if you reject Hegel, if you don't let me speak from Hegel, then you don't let me speak. And there's an irony there where the person wants to know you by rejecting you, right? So, but in another situation that's similar, you may actually be speaking Hegel to hide yourself, right? The content is all the same. And when you take you hiding and you being unveiled and speaking about Hegel, they're isomorphic in separation. But if you bring them together, you see a difference of intention that comes out. And the thing that comes out as different is precisely the weaving principle for Leibniz, which would be the intention or the will or so on. So the weaving is different, even if the determinations are the same. Javier's talking about Hegel, same determination, one situation, the weaving is different. But here's the thing. The weaving is not located in the determinations. The weaving is not there, and yet it is the very thing that makes the situation possible. So for Leibniz, situations are only possible because of something quote unquote metaphysical or metageometrical, something outside the situation, that is the weaving together of the situation, of which determines the quality of the situation. And then philosophy is therefore the judging of that quality that is not given by determinations, that must be made because there are determinations that have been arranged into situations. Because otherwise there would not be situations. So the other thing, you mentioned the tonal example, like this kind of idea that when Mr. Ebert was saying, like, you're trying to lower yourself to somebody's tone, right? And you're making them feel at home, but maybe you're just the master in the Stephen Hoffman movie where it's like Scientology and you're manipulating them, right? Same situation, but different weaving. So no, same determinations, different weaving, therefore different situation. And it would seem that the philosophical ability has a lot to do with the ability to judge the weaving of the determinations and therefore the quality of the situation that is not given by the determinations of the situation. Now, there's some other weird things for Leibniz where he would say other can be the same outside situation, but in situation, there can only be difference. So otherness has to be outside a situation that when you bring it together, then it's different. Like other can be the same when it is outside, but once you come together in a situation, you have same. This is a very important point because I think it may start to get at what this absolute recoil is and what the philosopher is learning, the skill they are learning to do, the holding together, the weaving. So the example that Leibniz gives in the Analysis of Citas, which Mr. Morley in his amazing book talks about, is you have two temples that are completely identical. And that's what he means by similar. Two things are similar if you could confuse them as the other in a different situation. So you have a temple in China and a temple in Brazil. And when you're in one of them, you think you're in the other until you walk outside and go, oh, I'm in Brazil. So they can't be the same. But when you were in them, until you were able to contrast them with the situation in which they were coordinated in, you could confuse them as the same. So the funny thing is, another way to put it, that the example I'll use to make the point, is imagine you have an apple that has a little dot on the top of it, okay? And you see it in the kitchen. And you go, oh, I'm going to eat that apple, but first let me go to the bathroom. And you go upstairs. And upstairs, you find an apple with a little dot on it. And you go, oh my gosh, how in the world did the apple downstairs get upstairs? That's crazy. Because it's so similar that you conclude it must be the same. So you take the apple and you say, well, let me bring it back to the kitchen. And you bring it to the kitchen and suddenly there's 2 apples and you're shocked. What are the chances? You know, what is the chances? Because something I thought was similar ends up being different, but you could not have known they were different until they occupied the same situation. And this is often what a relationship is. 2 people that are similar, it's like, oh my gosh, we're similar. We're basically the same. Similarity is precisely the necessary prerequisite for the experience of difference. And here's what happens. This is the weird move. You are the same outside the relation, but when you come together, you are translated into different in the same situation. The sameness moves from the entity to the situation as the whole. And so there's a sameness of the situation, but now it's unveiling a difference. So as you bring the determinations into the same situation, the sameness moves from the things to the situation. So suddenly there's this weird moment where everything is the same in something that unveils they are different. And you as the philosopher have to hold it together. That is your job, to weave, because it's recalling, well, it's not the same. Now I'm experiencing the difference, and you're saying, no, even though now I can experience the difference, I'm going to continue to believe my original judgment that there was a similarity here, that there was some sort of corresponding theme, and I'm going to hold them together against the proof of difference that I can only have in the situation. So now it seems absurd to believe there's a similarity between them because, look, they're different. But you go, no, I remember when I encountered this apple upstairs that it seemed like the exact same one, and I truly believe that, and I'm going to commit to that sense of a similarity against the proof of difference brought out in the situation, hold to that, therefore hold the situation together, and therefore the sameness is maintained precisely in the situation, though it's through the difference of the phenomenon in the determinations. So you as the philosopher have to hold it all together in your weaving, which looks crazy because they're obviously different apples. Have you lost your mind? There's no similarity. So against that, you have to hold it together and wait for the belief that the holding it together will somehow prove to be an event. So the event is the simultaneous movement of the sameness to the situation and the revelation of the difference, and the revelation that the world can be a place where things are so similar you can confuse them as one another when they are apart in situation. So the event changes the quality of the determinations and changes the quality of the situation they are in. And it's a shock. It's an absolute shock when it occurs. That's why marriage is a shock. You're bringing 2 people you thought were similar that could only unveil their difference when brought together. But the whole reason you brought together because you thought they were similar, not different. Bringing similarity together is the only way to find out how they're different. But you thought you were bringing them together to get away from difference. Turns out you created the condition in which the only condition when difference can come out. And so it's a shock. You're like, I thought similarity, I thought we were bringing these things together because there was no difference, because they were similar. No, I brought them together to create the only condition in which difference could be experienced. And you as the philosopher are basically getting ready for that absolute recoil, because your temptation is going to be what? Recoil, pull back. This is, I was tricked. I was tricked. I was tricked. But if you change your expectations and knew that similarity was the condition of the revelation of difference, you would adjust your expectation. You'd be ready to hold firm to the weaving. You'd be ready to hold firm to the choice. And you'd be ready to hold and wait for something to occur in that state of the holding up together, which will feel terrible because they're pulling apart and you're holding it together and you say, am I crazy? Am I crazy? Because these things are different. Have I lost my mind? No, you are the weaving principle to make possible the sameness of situation, to make possible the situation which all of those things have a meaning that they cannot have apart. You are there to hold them together. And if you stop holding them together, then they won't relate through situation. They won't have that share and they won't have the quality that comes with it. So you have to stay in that place because you decided the event keeps eventing. You decide if the relation keeps relating based on your commitment to the weaving, which of course runs the risk of you being absurd. But in this life, if we don't make the risk of being absurd, then we can't do anything awesome. But this has been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it very much. Mr. Luber came to Virginia, so thank you. And I've really enjoyed it. But no, the term metageometrical, the more I think Mr. Leibniz, it's helpful because we're always kind of coordinating the nature of a situation. An event is a situation. A form is a metageometrical term. Like there's a coordination of determinations to determine quality in light of that coordination. But you're all wonderful. Thank you for your time. I've enjoyed it very much.